Meanwhile, Anastasia received a call from a high-end bar, directly from the bar owner, asking her to come and retrieve Vasper's sports car. She let out a heavy sigh. She knew this bar well. It was the place she and Vasper used to frequent back then. Anastasia quickly hailed a taxi and headed to the bar. At the same time, Vasper stared at the whiskey bottle in front of him, downing the drink as though it were water. To him, the whiskey barely seemed to have an effect on his body anymore. Ever since he and Chanty had separated, whiskey had been his only remedy on sleepless nights. Yet, over time, it seemed as though his body had become immune to its effects. He'd been in the VIP room of this bar for over an hour now. Earlier, he'd chased after Jake and Shanta's car but couldn't catch up to them. They hadn't been at their mansion when he'd teleported there, so he'd gone straight to the bar to drink his frustrations away. He couldn't accept the fact that Jake had beaten him in the race. He suspected Jake had cheated, perhaps using his teleportation power to get ahead. Vasper knew Jake had his own black crystals that could remove his suspended bracelet, allowing him to use this ability during the race. It was possible Jake had used teleportation subtly enough that it only resulted in a few inches of advantage, making it hard to notice. In Vasper's mind, he might be wrong, but he couldn't shake the thought entirely. However, one thing Vasper could never accept was surrendering Chanty completely to Jake. He found it impossible to keep his promise to leave them alone after losing to Jake. The thought of not seeing Chanty, of living without her presence, drove him to despair, especially knowing she would eventually leave for the inner world. He needed to find a way, any way, to join her in the inner world of the Sylvan Concord. Lost in thought, Vasper stared at the whiskey bottle, waiting for Anastasia to come for the car keys. He had promised her the sports car as payment for her service to him. He was avoiding going to her apartment because Anastasia had recently been asking him to spend at least one night with her there. He didn't know what had changed in him, but while he once had no problem spending entire nights with Anastasia, both of them giving in to their wild sides and her doing everything to give him the best experience, now things were different. His desire for that thrill had faded. The excitement he once felt with women like Anastasia was gone. His body craved Chanty. He longed for her in a way that no other woman could fulfill. Even though he'd never taken her completely due to respecting her purity, the happiness he'd felt in her presence was incomparable, and it was what his entire being sought, his body, his soul. His life had changed completely. It had become miserable, his pride shattered. He was like a fool, following Chanty wherever she went, punishing himself with every step despite knowing he'd only end up hurt. How long would he have to wait for Chanty to return to his life? Vasper let out a deep, weary sigh, his chest tight with longing. If only he could take Chanty and never let her go, but the Sylvan Concord could track them anywhere. Every kind of power had a counter in the Sylvan Concord. And then there was Jake, who would never give Chanty up either, their love for her as deep as his own. It seemed the heavens had devised a way to make him suffer for all his sins toward women. "Chanty, please come back to me," Vasper muttered, the words almost like a prayer spilling from his lips. He felt Anastasia's presence drawing closer as she neared the room. He waited for the door to open. Upon entering, Anastasia was immediately greeted by the manager, who led her to the VIP private room. They moved through crowds of dancing patrons, the music's rhythm echoing around them. Many turned to stare at Anastasia as she passed, drawn by her striking beauty. Her allure seemed to capture every gaze, heads turned, men's eyes lingered, though she paid them no mind. Her purpose was unwavering, fixed on Vasper, and her indifference only added to the magnetic aura that surrounded her. At last, they reached the private room. She stepped inside and found herself in a dimly lit, secluded space. Vasper sat there on a plush sofa, surrounded by a table littered with whiskey bottles. His eyes locked onto her immediately, his gaze steady and clear, any hint of drunkenness absent from his intense stare. His expression was sharp, and, without speaking, he tossed the car keys in her direction. Anastasia caught them, her hand gripping the cool metal, but she didn't look away from him. In her eyes, he appeared burdened, an air of frustration settled on his features, yet there was something deeply captivating about him, a presence both strong and unattainable. His tousled hair fell slightly over his forehead, his legs sprawled out, hands resting casually on the arms of the sofa. His whole being exuded a magnetic, irresistible allure that drew her in. In that moment, she yearned to be close to him, to just sit on his lap and feel his presence. Vasper saw the desire in Anastasia's eyes at that moment, a familiar look he'd seen in every woman who'd been in his company. That longing gaze was something he was used to, yet it held no appeal to him. It was a look he wished only to see in Chanty's eyes, directed toward him. He looked down, eyes settling on the bottle of whiskey. Pouring himself a glass, the clink and splash of the amber liquid echoed through the quiet room. Without hesitation, he downed it all in one gulp. The sight of this made Anastasia's heart race. Vasper seemed even more captivating, every move exuding a raw magnetism. She couldn't help but fixate on him, and even the simple gesture of him running a hand through his hair left her nearly breathless. Yet, she felt an uncharacteristic hesitation in approaching him because of the seriousness etched into his face. Vasper glanced back at Anastasia, but his gaze was cold, indifferent. There wasn't a single sign of warmth or pleasure at her presence, as if her arrival meant nothing to him. She'd gone to great lengths to dress up for him, putting extra care into her attire, yet he hadn't shown even a hint of appreciation. It was vastly different from before, when Vasper would compliment her beauty and allure without hesitation. Now, she could feel the sting of his indifference, the unmistakable ache of rejection. Anastasia glanced around the room, realizing they were alone. Vasper hadn't even asked her to join him for a drink. Her heartbeat quickened. They were alone. Had he chosen to drink without any company tonight? She broke the silence, her voice soft yet tinged with curiosity. Vasper, are you alone here? She took a step closer, preparing to sit beside him, but before she could, he spoke, a voice firm and final. Anastasia, leave. I want to be alone. She froze, stunned by the coldness of his tone. For a moment, she simply stood there, silence stretching between them. Frustration welled up inside her as she remembered their agreement. Vasper, did you forget our deal? You promised, if you lost the race, you'd spend one night with me at my apartment, she reminded him, her voice firm yet pained. Vasper looked at her, unflinching. Tomorrow, I'll deposit it into your account, he replied, his voice void of warmth or emotion. A sharp pang stabbed at her chest. His response, so devoid of feeling, left her reeling. Do you have any feelings for me at all, Vasper? She whispered, her voice trembling. A tear slipped down her cheek, glistening in the room's low light. Yet he remained unmoved, his face a mask of indifference as silence thickened around them, broken only by her quiet sobs. Vasper. I think I love you, she admitted, her voice choked, exposing the depths of her heart to him for the first time. Her confession lingered in the air, vulnerable and raw. But Vasper's face remained stern, unchanged. Anastasia's body trembled with nerves, feeling as if she might collapse as weakness swept through her knees. This was the first time she had ever confessed her feelings to Vasper, and the intensity of her anxiety only grew as she noticed his stern, cold gaze locked onto her. It felt as if his icy indifference was piercing through her soul, a chill that ran deep into her core. In that moment, she silently prayed he wouldn't speak, fearing that his words would only shatter her heart further. Her breaths came fast and shallow, each one betraying her anxiety. And then, Vasper spoke. Anastasia, please, leave, he replied, his voice steely. I'm not in the mood for your drama. Tomorrow, when you wake up, it'll be in your account. Thanks for your services. She trembled at his words, a flash of anger lighting up her eyes through the tears. I hate you, she murmured, her voice breaking under the weight of her pain. She felt like melting from the overwhelming shame that flooded her. After everything she and Vasper had been through together? Did it all mean nothing to him? Meanwhile, she had held on to hope, believing that what they shared was heading towards something deeper, something serious. She would even accept being Vasper's mistress if it meant she could be by his side, a connection beyond a mere mutual understanding. But then, she saw him smile, a cold, sarcastic smile. Good, he replied, his tone cold and cutting. That's probably best. His voice was devoid of warmth, like a door shutting between them. Thank you. Now, please, leave. Vasper's tone was stern and demanding, an order he wanted obeyed immediately. Tears flow silently down Anastasia's face, though she stifled any sound that might escape. She never expected heartbreak to feel this painful. It was her first time experiencing rejection from a man, her first time feeling the sting of someone dismissing her womanhood. She was used to men falling over themselves to win her favor, to possess her, but Vasper was different. She was the one chasing him, craving his love, longing for his attention. "Vasper, you promised me. Did you forget our agreement?" she said, meeting his eyes with a serious, intense gaze. "Anastasia, I'm not in the mood. That's why I ordered to call you over, to pick up the car keys. You can leave now, take the car, it's yours. And check your account tomorrow, I've arranged everything." Vasper's reply was cold, both in tone and expression, as he took another swig of whiskey. Anastasia felt her heart ache even more, the sting of Vasper's words cutting deep, as if she were just another employee whose only connection to him was a paycheck. The intensity in her gaze deepened, her heartbreak and rage mingling as she looked at him. "Why are you like this, Vasper? This isn't right. I'm not asking too much from you. Is spending one night with me such a burden?" she demanded, stepping closer, hoping to bridge the distance between them. But Vasper abruptly stood, his expression implacable. "I'll leave if you won't go," he said, each word laced with finality. Vasper walked toward the door, his gaze fixed on it, not even glancing at Anastasia as he prepared to leave the room. But Anastasia blocked his path and wrapped her arms tightly around him. "Vasper, please don't leave," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Stay with me, even just for a moment. I want you right now. I've missed you so much." She looked up at his face, searching for a response, her embrace firm and desperate. But Vasper said nothing. Silently, he reached down and pried her arms away from his waist, carefully loosening her tight hold. Once her hands were free, he nudged her gently aside without so much as a glance in her direction, his eyes fixed sternly on the door. His face showed no trace of emotion for her, no softness, no sympathy. Just a cold, distant expression that seemed to shut her out completely. Without another glance, he walked out, the door closing firmly behind him, leaving Anastasia sobbing alone in the dim silence of the room. Vasper moved swiftly down the hallway, his face set in a severe expression, though beneath his calm facade, a storm brewed. He had no patience for others' emotions, not when he was drowning in his own. His heart ached for Chanty, a pain that throbbed in his chest with every step he took, an emptiness too vast to fill. He reached the restroom, and with one last glance around to ensure he was alone, he closed his eyes and teleported back to his mansion. Once there, he went straight to his room, his face a mask of steely resolve. Opening his jewelry drawer, he reached for the engagement ring he had once given Chanty, a delicate piece with a pink and a red diamond. He held it for a moment, his fingers brushing over its surface, memories of Chanty flooding back to him. Then, he placed it in a small red ring box and slipped it into his pocket, the weight of it pressing against him, a reminder of the love he could not let go, yet could never truly keep. Suddenly, he was startled when he noticed someone in his bed. He hadn't seen Samara there when he'd first entered the room, yet there she was, watching him intently, her gaze filled with a seriousness that unsettled him. Choosing to ignore her presence, he made his way straight to the closet, but before he could turn away, Samara sprang up, her face flushed with fury. "Vasper, is this how irresponsible you are?" she demanded, her voice tinged with disbelief. "You just disappeared from the hospital without a word. Good thing Laika was there to handle everything, thanks to her that things didn't spiral out of control. Even the doctors were wondering where you'd vanished to. We had to pay off the media to keep your disappearance out of the news. Where on earth did you go?" But Vasper didn't even look at Samara. He went straight to the bathroom, his silence more cutting than any words, carrying the clothes he'd taken from the closet to change into. Samara seethed with anger at his gesture, feeling entirely disregarded. She followed him into the bathroom, her face twisted in frustration at his constant snubs. Samara's anger blazed hotter at this dismissal, frustration etched across her face, determined to confront him. "Vasper, don't you dare turn your back on me when I'm talking to you," Samara shouted, her voice echoing off the room. "Where have you been? With Chanty again? running after her like some lovesick fool, she demanded, her words piercing. At that, Vasper turned around to face her. They locked eyes for a long moment, and he looked down at her stomach, now noticeably swollen with his child, a reminder of the mistake between them. He held back the words he wanted to say. He swallowed the words that rose in his throat, thinking that if she weren't carrying his child, his response might have been far harsher. Samara, while I'm still here finishing up my business, just pretend I don't exist, all right? That'll keep things peaceful between us. Vasper's voice was calm but cold, each word deliberate, as he closed the shower door behind him, not waiting for her reply, ending the conversation. Samara stood frozen with anger, motionless, tears stinging her eyes as she stared at the closed door. The sound of running water filled the room, a steady, indifferent rhythm that only deepened her hurt. As she took slow, heavy steps out of the bathroom, she stepped slowly back into the bedroom. Glancing at the clock, it was nearly 5 a.m. Sleep had eluded her all night, her restless thoughts circling back to him, to every moment of distance he had forced between them. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she waited for him to come out, her mind racing over the jewelry drawer he'd opened earlier. Where was he planning to take that ring? She hadn't seen the details of the ring itself, but wondered if it was meant for Chanty. The mere thought ignited her jealousy toward Chanty, knowing she was now married to Jake. Yet, despite that marriage, Vasper's heart was still hopelessly tied to her. Tears fell from Samara's eyes as she reflected on her situation, on how she'd hoped that carrying his child would win Vasper's love, but he remained distant, almost as cold as ice toward her. He was as distant as ever, his presence a shadow of what she yearned for. He'd arranged for a private doctor to care for her throughout the pregnancy, making sure she had everything she needed. But what Samara truly wanted was Vasper's presence in the mansion every day, to see him, to have him close. The sound of the shower ceased, and Samara braced herself as she heard him open the bathroom door. He emerged, freshly dressed in a fitted gray t-shirt that clung to his muscular torso and tight black pants that highlighted his powerful frame. He was drying his damp hair, tousling it carelessly, and without a glance in her direction, he started packing a large suitcase with his belongings, folding his clothes with mechanical precision. Samara watched him, feeling tortured as she looked at him, unable to stop the longing in her heart. She wanted to hold him, to kiss him, her attraction toward him as intense as ever despite the constant rejection and insults that chipped away at her dignity, pushing her further to the edge. Vasper's silence and precise movements only heightened her curiosity and unease. "Where are you going?" she finally asked, her voice shaking. "Are you leaving the mansion?" Still, Vasper remained silent, his face unchanging as he continued to pack, the stern look never leaving his eyes. "Vasper, answer me. Are you deaf? Are you blind? I'm standing right here in front of you," she cried, her voice cracking with desperation, fear creeping into her tone, her voice quivering with anger and fear of abandonment. Vasper finally stopped, standing upright, and looked at her with a serious gaze. In Samara's tear-stained eyes, he saw her raw vulnerability and felt a flicker of pity, but it was drowned by his resentment toward her. She was the reason for his and Chanty's separation. "Samara, you're not my wife," he said, his tone unforgiving. "I don't owe you an explanation for everything I do," he said in an icy tone. "Besides, Khalid has already begun packing up my belongings here. I'm leaving the mansion to you, for you and the child. The paperwork is nearly complete. You can handle it all when the baby arrives." The distance between them seemed to grow as his words struck her. A chill descended between them as his words sank in. Samara felt as if a knife had sliced through her heart as he laid out his decision, the pain raw and consuming. Her trembling hands balled into fists, rage and anguish swirling within her, trembling with a mix of rage and despair. "Vasper, it's your child." "Our child," she emphasized, her voice shook with a pleading desperation. "This is your choice, Samara, not mine," Vasper replied, his teeth gritted, his voice sharp, his gaze cold. In a sudden burst of fury, Samara slapped him hard across the face, her hand leaving a sharp sting on his cheek. They stared at each other, her gaze sharp and unyielding, filled with an intensity that he could not ignore. Her body shook as she glared at him, tears rolling down her cheeks, and her fists clenched tightly. "After everything, Vasper?" After every promise, every vow you made, she shouted, her voice hoarse with pain. I gave you everything. My virginity, my soul. I believed in every promise you made, but now you discard me like nothing? Samara. Vasper's voice thundered, jolting Samara with its force. It's been over between us for a long time. There's nothing left between us. But what did you do? You and Laika set this up, didn't you? A setup just to trap me? Vasper accused, stepping closer until they were inches apart. His eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to drill straight into her, his gaze full of accusation, his face a hard, unforgiving mask. Samara took a small, instinctive step back, her heartbeat quickening as fear flooded through her. Guilt twisted inside her, a cold reminder that Vasper was right. She and Laika had schemed together, hoping she could hold on to him if something happened between them, if she ended up pregnant with his child. Vasper. I didn't force you. If you'd wanted to walk away that night, you could have. But you stayed. You came to me. I didn't force you. Samara cried, her voice trembling with desperation as tears began to spill down her cheeks, her heart breaking under the weight of his words. You gave me the magic wine. If it hadn't been for that, Samara, I wouldn't have even been tempted by you. Remember that. So don't pretend you're some victim here. You're the reason Shanta left my life. You're the reason everything is falling apart for me. His voice dropped, quiet yet devastatingly sharp, each word slicing deeper than the last, piercing through any remaining defenses she clung to. Samara felt herself unraveling, the insult digging deep into her, hitting her pride, her heart, and her very identity. His words were a brutal reminder that the man she loved saw her as nothing more than an obstacle in his life, a stain on his happiness. Was she really to blame for the distance between him and Chanty? How could he ignore what they'd shared, all their memories together? It felt like her heart was being torn apart, bleeding under the force of his scorn. You're the one without shame, Vasper, she screamed, her voice raw and quivering. You and Chanty betrayed me. We were together, and then she showed up. So who's the real victim here, huh? Me or her? Who was in your life first? Wasn't it me? Me. Not her. Her voice cracked, echoing painfully around the room as she let out the tidal wave of frustration, hurt, and betrayal that had been building for so long. Vasper's expression turned cold and distant. We've been through this, Samara. There's no point going over it again. It only causes more pain. Stop pushing it. Just let it go, he said in a tone devoid of warmth. You never listen, Samara. You only hear what you want to hear. So please, Your Highness, if you'll excuse me, he said dismissively, turning away to continue packing his suitcase. But Samara's emotions surged beyond control. Consumed by anguish and fury, she rushed up to him, her voice breaking as she sobbed and shouted. She struck his chest, slapped his face, her fists pounding against him as she shouted, You have no shame, Vasper. I hate you. Each blow was fueled by her pain and devastation, raining down against him, every strike a desperate attempt to make him feel even a fraction of the agony tearing her apart. Vasper absorbed her attacks in silence, standing like a stone as she vented her anger. He allowed her fists to pound against his chest, all her curses and resentment spilling forth. But his heart remained impenetrable, leaving only indifference behind. Eventually, her blows weakened, and she slumped against him, wrapping her arms around him as she sobbed, clinging to him in desperation. Vasper, I still love you. I love you so much. Please don't leave. We need you, the baby needs you, she pleaded, burying her face in his strong chest, her arms around him in a desperate embrace. Vasper slowly took her hands, gently pulling them away from him, and Samara regained her composure, as though awakened from a trance. Samara, we're both miserable. My life is a wreck, more tangled than you can imagine. Can you just take care of yourself and leave me out of it? There's nothing left in my heart for you. Not then, not now. You're just one of the many women I foolishly got involved with, he said, his voice low but filled with unyielding finality. Samara looked at him, unable to believe the words that escaped his lips. Her eyes widened with disbelief as the weight of his confession sank in. This is my karma, Samara, my curse. And if you want to avoid getting entangled in it, then please, just stay away from me, he added, his tone cold and his gaze sharp, determined to convey his true intentions. But Vasper, I don't want to escape from you. I don't want you to leave my life. Samara sobbed, her voice filled with raw emotion. Ignoring her pleas, Vasper continued packing until he closed the suitcase, not sparing her another glance. Samara's thought fell on the ring box he'd taken earlier. The ring, Vasper. Who is it for? She asked, staring at him, searching his face for an answer. That's none of your business. Don't concern yourself with that, he replied curtly. Vasper, are you still obsessed with Chanty? She's married now, she has a husband, Jake. Samara shouted, her tone a mix of frustration and envy. Vasper's expression darkened, his face twisted with anger at the mention of Jake. Samara let out a sarcastic laugh. So, I pushed myself onto you, but here you are, desperately chasing after Chanty? She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. You'll never find happiness, Vasper. I'll make sure you never find peace with anyone else. Vasper didn't respond, merely observing her with a resigned expression. In her, he saw the same desperation that mirrored his own unrequited love. Vasper faced Samara, his expression serious, his gaze unwavering, piercing through her with a sharpness that felt like it was cutting straight to her core. His eyes held a resolute, cold edge, demanding silence, as if he were imposing a final boundary between them. In contrast, Samara's eyes shone with unshed tears, teetering on the edge of spilling over yet held back by sheer will. Her lip quivered slightly as she tried to maintain her composure, struggling against the wave of emotion that threatened to betray her fragile strength. The tears she fought to hide mirrored the turmoil in her heart, a silent testament to the ache she felt and her quiet desperation. She stood there, trembling but resolute, holding on to what little dignity she could muster, her emotions both suppressed and on the verge of breaking free, like a dam ready to burst. In that brief, charged silence, so much was left unsaid. But even so, I don't have love for you, Samara. Vasper's voice was cold, void of any warmth or compassion. I'll provide everything you and the child need. In the coming days, my lawyers will come and hand over the paperwork for the properties I'm giving you. All the cars here at the mansion, they're yours as well. I don't need your cars, Vasper. Samara's voice was sharp and resolute, filled with a bitterness that she could no longer suppress. They're for the child, Samara, not for you, he replied, his tone flat and final. Samara fell silent, momentarily stunned by the harshness of his response. The private plane has been arranged for you too. Whatever else you need, you can coordinate with my lawyers or with Khalid. He'll be staying behind to serve you. The doctor will come here every day, so there's no need for you to leave, you won't have to think about anything else. His words were calculated, almost mechanical, as though he were dictating orders in an impersonal transaction rather than speaking to the woman who once shared his life. The only thing I ask from you is this: don't disrupt my life any further. There's no reason for us to see each other again. I'll return only on the day I promised your parents. That will be my last commitment to you. Are we clear? His tone was firm, unyielding, a finality that left no room for objection. Samara glared at him, her eyes brimming with defiance and pain, the intensity of her silent gaze like a dagger aimed straight at him. Yet, Vasper didn't wait for her response. He simply turned his back, his decision already made. And then, in a heartbeat, he disappeared, teleporting away with his suitcase, leaving Samara standing alone in the cavernous silence of the room. As the reality of his absence crashed down on her, Samara's knees gave way, and she collapsed onto the bed. Her sobs erupted, racking her entire body, raw and unrestrained. Grabbing the pillows in a fit of rage, she hurled them across the room, one after the other, each throw a futile attempt to expel the agony tearing her apart. I hate you, Chanty. I hate you, she screamed, her voice hoarse and trembling with the bitterness of her jealousy and the depth of her sorrow. Her words echoed off the walls, a haunting testament to her heartbreak and the overwhelming sense of betrayal that consumed her soul. Vasper, I don't need all these things, all I need is you. Only you, Samara whispered to herself, her voice breaking, choked with tears. She clung to those words as though they were her last hold on sanity, repeating softly, I love you, Vasper. I still love you, even if you're a bastard. Why are you like this? Her voice trembled, desperate, as she wrapped her arms around her baby bump, her silent sobs shaking her fragile frame. Looking down at her stomach, Samara's heart ached with a fierce, protective love. A wave of grief and pity washed over her as she thought of her child, her innocent child, who would come into the world fatherless. A rage slowly simmered inside her, redirected at Chanty, the one she blamed for all of this heartbreak, the one who, in her eyes, had stolen Vasper away from her life. She thought of the ring box Vasper had stashed in his pocket, a painful reminder of the promises he once made to her and now seemed destined to make with someone else. The bitterness and envy that flared up every time she thought of Chanty clawed at her heart, consuming her thoughts, suffocating her spirit. The betrayal she felt was a wound that seemed to grow deeper each day, and every reminder of Chanty poured salt into that open, bleeding scar. Was the ring meant for Chanty? The thought tore at Samara's heart, a twisting ache of betrayal and bitterness. Her gaze landed on the portrait of Vasper's mother, whose eyes seemed to bore into hers with silent judgment. Your son is a bastard, she whispered to the portrait, anger dripping from every word as she stared back into those same piercing eyes that Vasper had inherited. Samara broke down in tears again, curling up on his bed, the bedroom walls bearing witness to her heartbreak and the misery that now engulfed her life. Meanwhile, Jake and Chanty were in the car but had not yet stepped out. They were parked beside a construction site. The mansion Chanty was building was only 50% complete, with much work still left. They watched as laborers continued working on her mansion, and Chanty felt a surge of happiness seeing the construction in progress. She was closer to finally seeing the mansion completed anew. When you return, this will surely be finished, Jake said. Thank you so much, Jake, Chanty replied, her voice wavering as she gazed at her mansion, almost tearful. Jake took her hand, kissed it, and said, You're welcome, my love. They shared a passionate kiss before turning their attention back to the work ahead. After a few minutes, Jake started the car, ready to drive them back to their mansion, where David was already preparing for Chanty's upcoming journey to the inner world. Today, as the sun sets, she would be taken to Sylvan Concord, with the verdant envoy acting as her guide. On their way, they stopped briefly at a vineyard to finalize some documents that required both Jake's and Chanty's signatures. Her secretary and personal lawyer assisted, ensuring all necessary paperwork was signed. They spent over an hour completing everything, and as they wrapped up, Chanty began feeling pangs of longing, despite not having left yet. In a private room, she stood before a picture of her father, Don Lorenzo, hanging on the wall beside her wedding portrait with Jake. She burst into tears, looking at the images of her parents on the wall. Papa, Mama, I miss you so much, she whispered. Jake, seeing Chanty in tears, felt his chest tighten. He held her close, kissing her forehead. Chanty clung to him, her longing for her parents intensifying, especially since she would soon be alone in the inner world. She was uncertain about her fate there, despite Jake's optimistic descriptions. But the thought of being by herself, without anyone familiar, weighed heavily on her. After finishing up at the vineyard, they finally headed back to their mansion, though traffic prevented them from finding an open road to teleport. They endured the long drive. Inside the car, Chanty was somber, knowing that in just a few hours, she would be leaving. Jake shared her silence, both of them lost in thoughts of longing. Chanty gazed out at the distant, lined-up cars due to heavy traffic, and Jake glanced at her, taking her hand, squeezing it, and bringing it to his lips for a kiss. Chanty felt tears well up again, knowing she would miss the warmth of his lips once she was in the inner world. At a stoplight, they exchanged a look filled with unspoken words, each feeling the weight of their emotions. Jake understood what she was going through. Jake, what if I don't go? What if I don't join the inner world? Chanty asked, her voice soft yet heavy with pain and longing for him. Jake looked at her briefly, his face serious, then turned his gaze back to the road. Chanty continued looking at him, wanting to hug him, to kiss him. I'll try to talk to the verdant envoy when we get home, Jake said, squeezing her hand again. But he knew the verdant envoy had no power to change the orders of the Sylvan Concord. He just said it to try to ease her mind. Chanty understood his tone. "I'll die from missing you, Jake," she whispered, tears streaming as she looked out at the road ahead. Jake looked at her, his voice soft yet breaking. "My love," he wanted to change the Sylvan Concord's decision if he could. At that moment, he wanted nothing more than to hold Chanty close and kiss her. "Jake," she added, "we'll endure the 1 year, right? Just don't go to the inner world during the Twilight Reckoning, okay?" She looked at him. She'd brought up this topic many times, wanting to ensure he wouldn't go there during that time. She feared the prophecy of the Sword of Destiny would come to pass, that Jake's path would cross with Alexander Mondragon's. But Jake only smiled, saying, "My love, that's the only chance we'll have to see each other." "Can I really endure my longing?" Chanty felt a jolt of fear and worry. "Jake, please. I don't want your path to cross with Alexander Mondragon's. Let's wait until our time, just for us, please," she pleaded, her voice quivering as her tears fell. Jake reached out, wiping her tears with a tissue from the dashboard. "Please don't cry," he said softly, his tone full of tenderness. But Jake remained silent. "Not all prophecies come true. Truth can be changed," he said. But Chanty still wasn't convinced. "But it's better to avoid it altogether, Jake, it's better to avoid it from happening. I don't want to see the prophecy that I foresaw come true. I only want Alexander Mondragon gone, not any of the other prophecies from the Sword of Destiny," she added, her voice full of sadness. Jake, curious, looked at her. "You still haven't told me exactly what the Sword of Destiny showed you." "Only Vasper knows everything, but I have no idea." He sounded frustrated, as Chanty had never shared the details of the prophecy with him. Chanty looked at him, full of pain. She didn't want Jake to feel the hurt of the prophecy. She turned away, gazing at the road and the cars in front of them. Jake continued to focus on driving, wondering why she wouldn't tell him about the prophecy. They both sat in tense silence for several more minutes as they approached the massive gate of their mansion. Just then, Jake and Chanty noticed a black car parked a short distance ahead. Jake's face showed a flash of anger as he glared at the luxurious black car. He suspected it belonged to Vasper. He knew Vasper was aware this was Chanty's last day here. Meanwhile, Chanty suspected she might see Vasper around this time. She knew his habits well. Her heart began to pound as Jake slowly parked the car in the garage. They noticed the 6 Guardians' cars lined up in the garage and Musa, one of the elven servants, greeting them with a respectful bow. Jake and Chanty unbuckled their seatbelts simultaneously, exiting the car at the same time, Jake holding his leather handbag containing his documents. Musa took Jake's bag, and they entered the mansion hand in hand, with Musa following behind. Inside, the 6 Guardians stood in the living room, all eyes on Jake and Chanty. But what shocked them was Vasper sitting on the couch, his gaze deadly serious and fixed on Chanty, ignoring Jake's cold stare. Chanty felt a sudden discomfort from Vasper's presence as the Guardians stood, waiting for Jake and Chanty to approach. "Jake, I'll head to the room to change," Chanty said, looking at him, and Jake nodded slowly, gazing at her. They shared a quick kiss, not minding Vasper's harsh look that never left Chanty. She smiled at David, but the 6 Guardians only nodded, their expressions serious. Chanty leaned in close to Jake, her voice a soft, pleading whisper. "Jake, please don't fight with him. Don't give him what he wants." She knew that Vasper could hear her as well, but she wanted Jake to keep his cool. Vasper's gaze darkened as he watched her intimate gesture toward Jake, his heart twisting with a jealousy so fierce it felt like a knife. Once, Chanty's whispers had been for his ears alone, now, they were for another man. His jaw tightened, his lips curved into a smile, but it was filled with bitter pain. The Guardians watched silently, observing Vasper's every move, sensing the tension in the air. Justin, among them, couldn't help but smirk as he watched Vasper's expression. He marveled at Vasper's endurance, impressed by how much pain he was willing to endure just to see Chanty, to breathe the same air as her, even if it meant standing in the home she now shared with another. Jake's gaze softened as he looked back at Chanty, nodding with a gentle smile. "Don't worry," he replied quietly. Chanty returned his smile, then quickly turned and hurried toward the grand staircase. Vasper's gaze followed her intently, almost mesmerized, his lips curving in a faint, longing smile as she ascended each step. Jake noticed this, and his own face hardened in response, his jaw clenched as he watched Vasper's eyes linger on Chanty. He loosened his necktie, restraining his own surge of anger, as Vasper's eyes stayed locked on Chanty until she reached the second floor and disappeared into their room. Then, Vasper's piercing gaze returned to Jake, and their eyes met, sharp, dangerous, and unwavering. Vasper's dark smile grew, a glint of something deadly in his expression, but his eyes remained cold and intense. Jake glared back, a silent challenge exchanged between them, each refusing to back down. The Guardians watched Vasper closely, fully aware of the threat he posed in that charged moment. Lewis stood relaxed, hands casually in his pockets, stationed behind David, while the other 5 Guardians sat on the sofa, legs spread in a stance of silent strength, their eyes never straying from Vasper. But Vasper showed no fear, not the slightest flicker of unease, despite the powerful men arrayed against him, and Jake himself, of all people, in his way. None of it mattered to him. He was willing to face them all if it meant seeing Chanty again. To him, her marriage to Jake held no meaning, no validity. In his eyes, that marriage was powerless under Sylvan Concord law, where Jake, bound by their rules, was forbidden to wed or even engage romantically with those he was duty-bound to protect, like Chanty. The Guardians remained on high alert, braced for any move Vasper might make, knowing well how dangerous he could be. "Jake, we didn't let him in, he just appeared here," said Lewis, indicating Vasper. Vasper looked only at Jake, saying seriously, "Jake, you know why I came." No need for more questions. Angered by Vasper's reply, Jake shot back, "You can leave, Vasper. You're not welcome here. We agreed that if I won the race, you wouldn't bother us. Don't you know how to keep your word?" Jake crossed his legs and took off his necktie, setting it on the center table, his eyes full of warning. Vasper's expression remained serious as he watched Jake. "I know I'm not welcome here," Vasper replied, his eyes briefly glancing at the Guardians before looking back at Jake. In an instant, Vasper disappeared before them, teleporting away. The room was filled with a tense silence, broken only when Jake, standing beside David, also vanished suddenly, teleporting in pursuit. Everyone stood alert, tense, as they processed what had just happened. Moments later, Jake reappeared, his face twisted in rage. "He took her. He took Chanty." Jake's shout echoed through the mansion, his anger palpable. The Guardians stared, shocked, trying to process Vasper's audacity. David shook his head and gazed outside, where he could see that the verdant envoy had sensed the threatening aura within the mansion and was quickly approaching. The mansion erupted into chaos. Alvin servants, along with Lorena, quickly spread the news about Shanta's abduction by Vasper. Panic swept through the staff as everyone scrambled to prepare for what was to come. "Jake, don't worry. The verdant will handle Vasper," David tried to reassure him. "Since he took her like that, he'll be brought to the inner world as well once they retrieve Chanty." But Jake couldn't be consoled. He clenched his fists tightly, pacing back and forth in the living room, seeming unable to hear anything David was saying. His face contorted with fury as the Guardians watched him, feeling the weight of his emotions. Without warning, Jake disappeared again, determined to find Chanty. The Guardians exchanged knowing glances and quickly followed, leaving the mansion to pursue Jake, each jumping into their vehicles and speeding through the gate onto the road. Meanwhile, Jacob's jaw clenched as he thought about Vasper. If he saw him again, he'd make him pay dearly. That was the only thing running through Jacob's mind as he charged forward to save his beloved Chanty. Even though Jacob had surrendered his love for Chanty to Jake, he refused to let Chanty ever go back to Vasper. He knew that life with Vasper would only bring her misery. More than anything, Jacob wanted to see Chanty happy, to see her live a life full of joy, even if it wasn't with him. Despite the lingering ache in his heart, he accepted that only Jake could bring Shanta the happiness and security she deserved. And because he knew Jake's character well, Jacob never tried to interfere with their relationship. On the contrary, he supported it fully, knowing Jake would keep Shanta safe. But as long as Vasper was alive, any hope of peace in Chanty and Jake's life was impossible. Vasper's possessive nature toward Chanty was unrelenting, much like Jake's own fierce hold on her when she had still been with Vasper. There was only one way for Jake and Chanty to find true peace in their marriage. Vasper had to disappear from their lives completely. A dark smile played at Jacob's lips as he drove down the road, trailing David's car. "David, go ahead. I'll follow soon. There's just something important I need to take care of first," Jacob muttered into the air, as if David were sitting right next to him. He knew his voice would reach David, thanks to their heightened hearing abilities. David's reply came back, clear and immediate. "Make it quick, Jacob. We have a lot to take care of, and we need you," he said, his tone stern. Jacob didn't answer. Instead, he veered off the main road, retracing his path as he made his way towards something, or someone, he knew he needed to face alone. Meanwhile, the 5 vehicles carrying his allies continued on their way to David's mansion, leaving Jacob behind to handle his private mission. His face was set in a hard, unyielding expression as he drove. Eyes fixed intently on the road, his mind sharpened with determination. He barely blinked, his thoughts racing, his resolve unwavering. This was something he had to do, a decision made in the depths of his heart that left no room for doubt. Meanwhile, Chanty curled up on a single-seater sofa, making sure Vasper couldn't sit beside her. She kept her head buried in a pillow, refusing to look at Vasper, who sat in front of her, staring intently, waiting for the verdant envoy to arrive. Knowing they were likely searching for them at this hour and that it was nearly time for Chanty to be taken to the inner world. The silence between them was thick with unresolved pain. In her silent fury, Chanty refused to utter a word to Vasper, maintaining a quiet, unyielding distance ever since he had taken her from Jake's mansion and brought her to this place against her will. She couldn't bring herself to talk to him because it felt pointless. He never listened to anything she had to say. All she could do now was wait, hoping Jake would track her down and take her back. With only a few hours left before the envoy would come to take her to the inner world, Chanty knew she should be spending this time with Jake, but here she was, taken by Vasper. Her anger toward him was beyond boiling point. The small hint of compassion she had once felt for him had been completely overshadowed by her seething rage. Vasper had no respect whatsoever for her marriage to Jake. He didn't care that she belonged to someone else now. What fueled her anger even more was the broken promise Vasper had made to her. They had an agreement that if Jake won the race, he would leave her alone. Yet, here he was, having shattered his word. Chanty's fury toward Vasper, combined with the deep longing she felt for Jake, brought her to tears. She didn't even want to look at Vasper's face. She heard his deep, frustrated sighs as he sat nearby, but she refused to acknowledge him. Hours had passed in utter silence between them, neither had spoken a word. Vasper simply waited, watching her, but she did everything she could to ignore his presence. It pained her to think of the man who had once meant so much to her, now reduced to a source of anger and disgust. She never imagined she'd reach a point where her feelings for Vasper would turn into this level of resentment. The memory of seeing him intimately entangled with Anastasia at the race event replayed over and over in her mind. She'd stumbled upon them on the sofa, Anastasia straddling him, her arms wrapped tightly around his neck, and he had his hands on her waist, holding her close as they shared a passionate kiss. They were so absorbed in each other that they hadn't even noticed Jake's car pulling up in front of them. That image had burned itself into her memory, impossible to erase. She used it as a reminder that she'd made the right decision choosing Jake, and she was grateful she'd broken free from Vasper's hold over her life. And now, despite everything, Vasper had the audacity to forcefully take her away, acting as if he could have whatever woman he wanted, whenever he wanted. What did he think? That he could kiss Anastasia one moment and then turn his attention back to her, as if she would be waiting for him? Not to mention he had a pregnant girlfriend back at the mansion. My God. Chanty thought, a chill running through her as she felt trapped in a nightmare. She screamed inwardly, "Jake, please save me from this hell." Tears streaked down her face as she cried in desperation, "Save me, Jake." Vasper's chest felt heavy watching Chanty cry since they entered the room, and it took all his strength not to reach out and hold her. She hadn't argued with him, hadn't said a word. Suddenly, she ran to the single-seater sofa and burst into tears. Vasper wanted to embrace her then, but was afraid she'd grow even angrier with him. Vasper stood and slowly approached her, dragging a sofa beside her. However, just as he was about to sit, Chanty abruptly stood up, rushed into the room, and slammed the door shut without even looking at him. Vasper was stunned by her reaction, his chest twisting with pain from how she avoided his presence. Vasper struggled to process the pain that gripped him, each heartbeat echoing her coldness. In just a few hours, the verdant envoy would come, and they would be separated. He didn't know when he would see her again. He wanted to have a serious conversation with her. He stood up and teleported into the room, hearing her lock the door. Yet, upon entering, she wasn't there. He hurried to the bathroom, but she wasn't there either, although he could still sense her presence. Where could she be hiding? He inspected every corner, opened the cabinets, but there was no sign of her. Then, he glanced at the bed, and his gaze lingered on the floor beneath it. He had a suspicion she might be under there. Crouching down, he peeked under the bed, and his guess was right. There was Chanty, squeezed into the tight space. Their eyes met, but hers were filled with sharp anger. Vasper didn't say anything and moved slowly toward the bed, nudging it closer to the wall as Chanty slid along with it, pressing herself tightly against the wall. Without warning, Vasper lay down on the floor and crawled under the bed toward her. Chanty was shocked, watching him move closer, but there was nowhere for her to escape. She was trapped against the wall with limited room to move. When Vasper reached her, he pulled her by the waist, and they were pressed against each other. Chanty tried to push his arms away, but she was no match for his strength. Suddenly, Vasper lifted the bed with one hand and moved it away from them, and just as Chanty tried to wriggle out of his grasp, he teleported them both to the top of the bed, where she found herself beneath him. In his possessiveness, Vasper spread her thighs and positioned himself between them. Chanty slapped him across the face, hitting him repeatedly, but no matter how hard she pushed against his chest, he wouldn't budge. She remained silent, her breathing ragged, tears streaming down her face, while Vasper gazed at her sternly, eyes closed, enduring her slaps and punches. In this silent struggle, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were Chanty's sobs and labored breaths as her energy drained. She looked at Vasper, her eyes fierce with anger, chest heaving from exertion, her face red from the intense emotions. Still, Vasper's gaze didn't falter as he looked at her, until his eyes drifted down to her lips. Chanty's panic grew as she turned her face away, feeling Vasper's body pressing heavily on her, his arousal evident. Both of them were breathing heavily. She could barely catch her breath under the weight of his body against hers. But for Vasper, this was different. "Chanty," he whispered, his voice thick with desire and longing. Chanty's tears fell harder, and she couldn't bear it anymore. She screamed Jake's name. "Jake! Help me! Please! Take me away from here, Jake," she cried, avoiding Vasper's face. At her desperate plea for Jake, Vasper felt a stab of pain and, unable to hold back, seized her mouth in a fervent kiss, biting down on her lips. Vasper's kiss was a mixture of longing, so much aching, raw yearning, and love. It felt as if he were starving for Chanty's lips, but she kept hers firmly closed, refusing to respond, turning her face away whenever she could. Suddenly she couldn't move. She could feel the heat of his breath, his warm lips pressing against hers. Yet in her mind, all she could see was Anastasia's face, the image of Vasper kissing her still fresh, and it filled Chanty with revulsion. What was he thinking, moving from Anastasia straight to her? Did he truly think so little of her? These questions surged through her thoughts. As she sensed the intensity of Vasper's kiss, her heart pounded with a mix of fear and helpless anger. Chanty's body felt like it was reserved solely for Jake, every inch of her skin belonged only to him. She believed Vasper had no right to touch anything that was meant solely for Jake. Panic welled up within her, but she was powerless. Her mind was fighting with all its strength, but her body was too weak to resist. Vasper's kisses brought physical pain, laced with the force of his desperation. Chanty's tears kept flowing, one after another, as she silently cried out Jake's name in her mind. She felt trapped, vulnerable, and utterly helpless. The bed shook as Vasper's movements intensified, consumed by the heat of his body and his mixed pain. Chanty tried to pull away but was unable to move. Vasper had used an invisible shield to trap her. She could only scream Jake's name in her mind as her tears streamed down. Vasper's grip tightened around her as he kissed her neck, his body filled with a desperate hunger for her. Whispering into the air, he murmured. I miss you so much, Chanty. I'm losing my mind missing you. I can't bear it anymore, his words repeated over and over. Vasper's hand crept hungrily under Chanty's blouse, eagerly squeezing her breasts. A groan escaped from Vasper as he grasped her, though he couldn't hold her fully because of the bra still covering her. Meanwhile, in her mind, Chanty screamed desperately, no, again and again as the warmth of Vasper's palm continued exploring her skin and body. Vasper, stop, was the repeated plea echoing in Chanty's mind. He tore Chanty's blouse and bra as though it were paper, his hand cupping her breast with a longing to touch her as he once did. His lips and tongue hungrily traveled across her skin, moving from side to side, like a starving man tasting food for the first time. Chanty felt the pain of what Vasper was doing to her, physically and emotionally. Her panic grew as Vasper's hand slipped inside her pants, reaching her sensitive skin. Chanty's panic only deepened as she felt the heat of Vasper's hand and fingers touching and playing with her sensitive flesh. In her mind, it was Jake she was calling out to, desperately pleading for him, while fury simmered within her against Vasper for trampling over her boundaries and exploring her body without her consent. In her fury, she imagined the sword of destiny. Suddenly, it appeared in her right hand, breaking through the invisible shield, allowing her to move. As Vasper continued kissing her chest, he noticed the sword in her hand, and it was as though he finally snapped back to reality. He froze, staring at Chanty as she cried, pleading for him to stop. Vasper felt as if he had gone deaf. He could see her crying face but heard nothing. Slowly, he pulled his hand out from her pants, noticing her chest, flushed from his rough touch. Her neck bore marks from his kisses, and her face was a picture of terror and dread, her sobs unending. Full of fear and distress as she continued to sob. A chilling realization settled over Vasper as he covered her chest, though her blouse and bra were too torn to close. His heart broke as he whispered, Chanty, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it. Forgive me, as he touched her face and hair, drenched with sweat. She continued to sob, Jake, please save me, repeatedly. Chanty, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to, forgive me, please, Vasper murmured. Chanty kept crying, repeatedly calling out, Jake, please get me out of here. Her voice echoed in Vasper's heart, piercing it deeply. Chanty, forgive me. I've gone mad with love for you. I can't think of anything else but you, forgive me, he said, now crying as well, his voice choked with regret. He pressed his face against her neck, sobbing, as he repeated, please, forgive me. I didn't mean for any of this. I was blinded by my longing for you. Every night and every day, all I think about is you. My longing for you is unbearable, even in my dreams, you're all I see, all I want to kiss and hold. Chanty, lost in shock, stared blankly at the ceiling. She was like a stone that dwelled within Vasper's body, while Vasper sobbing against her neck, she felt his tears soaking into her neck. Forgive me, I never wanted to hurt you. Vasper choked out, his voice heavy with remorse. But I did something I never imagined, forcing myself on someone. I can't bear the ache of missing you. I'm madly in love with you, Chanty. And every time I see you with Jake, it's like dying 1,000 times over. He looked at her desperately. Once, it was just you and me, your hugs, your kisses, your smiles. Why are they all his now? Please, come back to me. I can't live without you. He pleaded. Please, come back to my life. I can't live without you, Chanty, Vasper continued. He's desperate. You're the only woman I want, the one I love like this. Please, come back to me. Leave Jake and come back. Vasper begged, his voice breaking. But Chanty remained silent, listening. When Vasper quieted down, realizing himself, he lifted his face slowly to see Chanty, who was now motionless. Vasper looked at Chanty's hand again, the sword was gone, and she was no longer crying. Their eyes met. Chanty covered her chest with her torn blouse. Vasper's chest heaved as he tried to let Chanty move her arms. He sat up, knelt, took off his t-shirt, and offered it to Chanty to wear, but she did not want to put it on. She refused to take it, pulling herself up and standing as she clutched her torn clothes close, as though they were her last defense, covering her chest with her ripped clothing so her breasts wouldn't be visible. Vasper stood as well, took back his t-shirt, and put it on. "Take me back to my husband, Vasper," she demanded in a low, cold voice, her eyes piercing him with every word. "Jake is waiting for me." Vasper's expression shifted, his sorrow almost instantly returning to desperation. "Please, just a little more time with me," he pleaded, his tone soft, almost childlike, as if a few more moments could somehow change everything. Vasper pleaded, his eyes filled with gentleness and longing to be with Chanty before she left to the inner world. But Chanty's frustration bubbled into anger, though she restrained herself. "Jake is my husband, Vasper. We're married. Take me back to my husband, please. I need to be with him." Her voice held a fierce resolve. She begged, almost in tears, her voice trembling, breaking any illusion he might still have held. She couldn't bear another second in that room. "I'll get you some clothes," Vasper replied, leaving Chanty stunned. This was his way. If he didn't want to answer something, he'd divert the conversation to another topic. Vasper suddenly disappeared in front of her, and she breathed a sigh of relief. She hurriedly ran out of the room, heading for the door in the living room. But when she opened it, it was locked and wouldn't budge. She kept pulling the doorknob, but it wouldn't open. Then, out of nowhere, Vasper appeared beside her. Chanty was startled, frightened that Vasper had caught her trying to escape. Vasper said nothing but handed her a set of clothes. It was a jogging suit she used to wear on their private island when they used to jog together. A jogging suit from a time long past, now painfully nostalgic. Chanty stared at the clothes, knowing she had no choice but to accept them. She quickly took them from Vasper's hands, ran back to the room, hurried to the bathroom, and quickly changed. She folded the clothes she had taken off, not wanting to leave Vasper with anything she had taken off. In the bathroom, she kept whispering Jake's name. "Jake, please, why are you taking so long to find me?" Then suddenly, Vasper appeared before her. "Please, I don't want to hear his name in my house," he said coldly, and Chanty felt as if a cold bucket of water had been poured over her. She quickly ran out of the bathroom, clutching her discarded clothes in her right hand. Meanwhile, Vasper slowly stepped out of the bathroom, approaching Chanty with a sorrowful look on his face, his conscience still struggling with what he'd done to her. He wanted to embrace her, shower her with kisses, but he restrained himself. "Chanty, I'm so sorry. Earlier, I lost myself in my feelings," Vasper said, facing Chanty, who still had fear in her eyes. "Vasper, please, take me back to my husband. Take me back to the mansion. I need to go. I should be with my husband. Please, Vasper, I'm begging you," Chanty pleaded, her voice quivering as she looked at him with tearful, pleading eyes. "Chanty, do you love him more than me?" Vasper asked, barely able to get the words out. Chanty was caught off guard by the question. "Vasper, how can you even ask me that?" Chanty replied, her brow furrowing. "I wouldn't have married Jake if I didn't love him," she said with finality and honesty. Vasper's face reflected deep sadness and pain. "So please, Vasper, I'm begging you. Set me free. Let Jake and I live in peace," Chanty pleaded in a tone of supplication, hoping he would understand. "What about me, Chanty?" Vasper asked, moving slowly toward her. Chanty took a step back. "Vasper, can we talk without you getting any closer?" "Just stay there, don't come near me," Chanty said, her voice trembling as she worried about what Vasper might do next. Just a while ago, she had felt like she couldn't face Jake, overcome with shame. Her conscience was heavy because of Vasper. He had touched her in places meant only for Jake. But because of Vasper's desperation, she had been left with no choice. She felt trapped by both him and her shame, unable to imagine how she would ever face Jake after everything that had happened. Vasper had violated a part of her that should have been sacred, meant only for her husband, and the shame of it sat like a weight on her heart. "What about my feelings for you? What about me?" Vasper asked Chanty. "I can't live without you, Chanty," he added, now standing right in front of her. Chanty was cornered, backed against the wall beside the door, crying as she looked up at Vasper, no longer knowing how to make him understand. Vasper, just move on. Forget about me. Stop following me, stop showing up. Take care of your family, Vasper. You're going to have a child soon, they need you. We both have our own responsibilities now, Chanty added. But Vasper's face showed only desperation. She's just a mistake, Chanty. She's not my wife, and I don't love her. I love you. I want to be with you. Only you, he insisted, dropping to his knees before her. Chanty felt panic rise within her as Vasper fell to his knees before her. She could feel her body trembling in fear as he looked up at her, a broken man begging for a second chance. Stand up, Vasper. Chanty cried, her voice thick with frustration, her eyes brimming with tears as she looked at Vasper's desperate face. Even if you kneel right there, nothing will change our situation. I'm married to Jake. Bound to him. Nothing can undo that. Her words struck Vasper with raw intensity, tears pooling in his eyes and streaming down his cheeks. Chanty's own heart thudded with fear, terrified that she might be swept away once again by her own emotions. She couldn't allow herself to fall victim to her heart's betrayal once more, couldn't risk reliving that pain. She was determined to bury any feelings she had for Vasper because she knew they would only lead to heartbreak for everyone involved if she allowed them to grow. Vasper's eyes, wet and pleading, were locked onto Chanty's, his sobs deep and filled with a hollow ache. His gaze didn't leave her face or her tearful eyes, and in the tense silence, he whispered, "Please, hold my hand," his voice trembling as he reached out his right hand toward her, desperate. Chanty, tears streaming down her face, stared at his extended hand and then up into his face, feeling a conflict rip through her. "Please, let's start over, Chanty," he continued, voice broken yet hopeful. "I'll make everything right if you're just by my side, if you're only here with me." His plea was heartfelt, tinged with an almost magnetic allure, as if he could pull her into his orbit with just his words. But Chanty stared at him, incredulous, as a wave of disbelief overtook her. How can you say that, Vasper?" After kissing Anastasia at the racing event, she choked out, staring straight into his eyes. "How can you say that to me after that? You don't know what it means to have enough, do you, Vasper? Can you please just leave me out of your list?" Her words landed hard as she held his gaze, and Vasper froze, his hands slowly lowering as the weight of her rejection settled in. Silently, he dropped his head, wiping away his tears with shaking hands. In that brief, vulnerable moment, Chanty seized the chance to escape, backing away as Vasper knelt with his head bowed. Desperate to escape, she darted toward the bathroom, but after only a few steps, Vasper grabbed her by the waist and embraced her from behind, holding her tightly. "Chanty, I love you so much. Please come back to me." "Leave Jake, there's nothing going on with Anastasia," Vasper said, holding Chanty tightly, his voice a low murmur in her ear. "She approached me because it's her job, she always works the races. But there's no relationship between us." Chanty's frustration only grew as she struggled against his embrace. "No relationship? Yet you were kissing her? On the sofa? Right in front of me, Vasper, I saw everything," she shouted, her voice sharp and trembling. "Don't try to convince me with your words, Vasper. I can't accept it anymore. Just let me live in peace with Jake. Let me be happy with him," she cried, her voice breaking with each word. "No." Vasper's voice was desperate, his grip on her tightening as he held her closer. "I can't bear it without you. I can't let you go, Chanty. I know I'm still in your heart. I know I haven't disappeared from there yet." His tears fell freely as he spoke, the words spilling out between sobs. "I'll take you to a place where we'll be alone. You won't have to leave me, you won't have to return." His lips found her neck, holding her as though he could keep her with his embrace alone. "Vasper." Chanty's voice was thick with anger and sorrow, her heart pounding. "I'm married. Don't give me more reasons to hate you. I love Jake, I won't trade him for you, Vasper. I won't accept this side of you. You were just with Anastasia, and now you're here, kissing me?" She struggled against him, her voice sharp with contempt. You have no shame. Let me go, she cried, the weight of her hurt spilling into every word. Believe me, she's not my girlfriend. Vasper's voice was a plea, strained and broken. There's nothing serious between us. That kiss you saw, it's normal at racing events, nothing more. It won't happen again, I promise. His voice softened, desperate and raw, but Chanty's anger flared anew at each excuse he gave. Please, forgive my mistakes. Let's start over, Chanty. Let's rebuild what we had. I swear it'll be different, I won't make those mistakes again, he whispered, his words hanging in the air between them, thick with the weight of regret and longing. Vasper pleaded, while Chanty sobbed and struggled, trying to pry his arms away. Vasper's face pressed against her neck, his lips brushing her skin. Let me go, Vasper. Please. Chanty sobbed. I regret ever seeing you again, Vasper. I regret everything about meeting you, she screamed, her voice filled with sobs. In her anger, she bit down on Vasper's arm as hard as she could, but Vasper only held her tighter. She clenched her teeth on his skin, but he still didn't let go. Eventually, she grew weak from struggling, her energy drained. Vasper felt her resistance weaken. He lifted her and carried her to the bed. As Chanty realized he was carrying her to the bed, she struggled even more, trying to free herself from his hold, but Vasper was determined, and he managed to lay her down on the bed. Vasper laid Chanty down on the bed, but Chanty kept shouting in frustration, striking Vasper on his chest and face. Despite this, Vasper positioned himself between Chanty's legs. Chanty felt helpless against Vasper's strength. He took both her hands and held them above her head, his face growing intensely serious, his eyes blazing as he looked at her. It was the first time Chanty had seen that look in his eyes. Vasper's hair was disheveled over his face, and his allure grew even stronger. Chanty suddenly fell silent, watching him, trying to read his expression. Was he angry, or what? She couldn't tell. They stared at each other, eyes locked. Vasper held both of her wrists in one hand above her head, their faces inches apart, both breathing deeply. His gaze was sharp. Vasper, take me back to my husband. Let me return to my home, Chanty said quietly but firmly. Yet Vasper simply stared at her face, her eyes, her lips. Chanty's heart pounded as she noticed this unfamiliar intensity in his eyes. She was overcome with nervousness as Vasper's thumb brushed her lips, but she turned her head away to avoid his touch. Vasper leaned closer to her ear. I really missed you right now. I really want you right now, Vasper murmured in a low voice filled with desire and longing. Chanty felt the heat of his breath against her skin, and her heartbeat quickened even more as his lips slowly kissed her neck, tender and full of love, as if awakening sensations in her body that had been lying dormant. Chanty could almost hear her heartbeat pounding like thunder. She tried to pull away, but she couldn't move under the strength with which Vasper held her. She couldn't turn her head either, knowing their lips might meet. Tears began to fall as she thought of Jake. She didn't want to betray him, didn't want to break his trust. Her body should belong only to her husband, to Jake. Yet what Vasper was doing to her was stirring old feelings, her body responding to the heat of his lips and breath as he kissed her neck. Still, she resisted as much as she could. No. No. Chanty shouted. Vasper. Stop. Please, stop, Vasper. Let me go back to Jake. She struggled to free her hands from his grip, but Vasper's hold was too strong. Chanty, I love you so much. We both know you're mine, Vasper said between kisses on her neck. His voice deepened, almost groaning as his lips continued to explore her skin, his tongue tracing over her skin, igniting sensations she fought hard to resist. Vasper tried to catch her lips, but Chanty turned her face away, although he didn't force her. He continued kissing her neck, slowly, deliberately, with a rhythm that was both passionate and torturous. His tongue hungrily traced over her skin. He ignored Chanty's pleas, and Chanty felt something firm pressing between her thighs as Vasper's body pushed against hers. Chanty turned her head even further away to avoid Vasper's lips, but this only seemed to work to Vasper's advantage. Growing exhausted from struggling, she felt her strength draining as she tried to resist his force. Vasper's thumb continued to stroke her lips, but Chanty kept her mouth closed. Yet her body was beginning to react to what Vasper was doing, awakening the very feelings she dreaded. She went quiet, staring up at the ceiling, catching her breath. Vasper finally stopped what he was doing and looked down at her face, their eyes meeting, hers filled with tears. "You are truly shameless, Vasper," she shouted, hoping to sever whatever feelings were taking hold of her. More tears streamed down her face, but Vasper gently wiped them away with one hand. Chanty turned her face away, refusing to let him touch her, but he leaned close to her lips, though he didn't press them to hers. "I miss you so much," he whispered. "I know you feel it too. In your dreams, Vasper. I'm not like you. Let me go." Chanty shouted again, and suddenly, Vasper's other hand slipped into her pants, into her underwear, touching her sensitive skin. This action sent a wave of panic through Chanty. Her mouth fell open in shock at his sudden move. Vasper's fingers felt the wetness, gliding over it, and he smiled mischievously. "You're lying," he said in a deeply seductive tone. Chanty could feel the warmth of Vasper's breath on her lips, even though their lips never touched. He pressed a brief, soft kiss on her lips, and the look in his eyes was enough to melt her. A surge of butterflies fluttered in her stomach, causing Chanty's face to flush. Vasper slowly and deliberately traced a finger along her sensitive skin, making Chanty gasp at the sensation, before withdrawing his hand. He brought the finger to his mouth, licking it while maintaining eye contact with her. Chanty's mouth was left agape as she stared at Vasper, unable to believe what he'd done. She felt a mix of shame toward herself and anger at Vasper, feeling humiliated by his actions, as if he had made her feel small in that moment. Her face turned bright red from embarrassment, and she wished she could simply vanish from Vasper's sight, like a bubble disappearing. Her body started to tremble even more. "Jake! Jake! Save me! Get me out of here!" Chanty cried, indifferent to the fact that Vasper laughed at her reaction, clearly amused by her response. But suddenly, they both felt a surge of energy, and Vasper immediately became alert, as did Chanty. They locked eyes, both tense. Chanty thought it might be Jake and the envoys. The energy she sensed made her happy, and her face lit up. "Jake is here," she exclaimed, her voice filled with excitement. But Vasper's face darkened with anger. Like a flash of lightning, Vasper pulled Chanty into a tight embrace, and they teleported to another place. In an instant, their location changed, and they were no longer in the same room. Chanty, startled by the sudden shift, stood there, mouth open, taking in her new surroundings. She looked around in shock, realizing they had been teleported in the blink of an eye. She had no idea where they were now, only that they were in a room surrounded by curtains, with a large bed in the center and several cabinets lining the walls. Chanty was still dazed by what had happened. She was so close to being saved by Jake, but Vasper had teleported her away at the last second. Watching Vasper move quickly toward the cabinets, she realized he was searching for something, slipping on a vest with a serious, alert look on his face. He also put on leather boots. Chanty felt a growing anxiety, understanding that Vasper was preparing for a confrontation. "Vasper, there doesn't need to be a fight. Just take me back to the mansion and leave peacefully. There's no need for violence. Just return me calmly to the mansion," Chanty pleaded, watching him retrieve a gun and place it at his waist. Tears streamed down her face as she begged him. Vasper looked at her seriously, yet continued to prepare, gathering more weapons from his drawers. Chanty, trembling, approached him, desperate to reason with him, to plead. "Vasper, please. There's no need for a fight. Just take me back peacefully, I beg you." She cried harder, her tears flowing freely, while Vasper paused, seemingly softened by her pleading, stepping closer. However, his posture and aura remained tense and powerful. "Where I go, you go, Chanty," he said. "Your home is by my side." Chanty cried even harder, knowing that Jake and the Guardians, along with the envoy, would never allow this. Vasper was vastly outnumbered. "Vasper, you don't stand a chance against them, they are many, and you are alone," she warned him, her voice shaking, not out of fear for her own life, but for his. Vasper laughed bitterly, looking at her with a pained smile. Isn't that for the best? If I lose, you and Jake can be free. You can both be happy, he said. Chanty was speechless, staring at Vasper, her body trembling, feeling a sudden chill run through her. But Vasper continued, his tone firm, I can't return you to them, Chanty. They'll have to take you from me, over my dead body. His final words left Chanty breathless, her breathing growing heavier. From his pocket, Vasper took out a small ring box, and when Chanty saw it, she was confused. Do you see this? He asked as he opened the red velvet box, revealing a red and pink diamond ring, her old ring. Chanty couldn't quite understand her emotions. This ring belongs to you, Chanty. Tonight, whatever happens to me, can you take this from my pocket? It's all I can leave you, Vasper said softly, his voice filled with sadness. Chanty cried harder, looking at the ring, and Vasper closed the box and placed it back in his pocket. It's here, in my pocket, he said, tapping it to show her. Wherever I end up, I'll try my best to keep it from falling out, he said, zipping the pocket where he'd placed the ring box. Unable to hold back any longer, Chanty ran to Vasper and embraced him tightly. Vasper, please just live. Don't die. Please, she sobbed, her grip on him fierce, putting all her strength into her embrace. Vasper, momentarily stunned, hugged her back tightly as well, both of them crying and Vasper laughing at the same time. They held each other in a powerful embrace, their cries mingling in the room. Vasper gently kissed Chanty's hair, pressing his lips to her neck. I was right, you still love me. I love you so much, Chanty, Vasper sobbed, kissing her over and over on her hair. Chanty continued to cry, answering, yes. I still love you so much, Vasper. But I hate you too. You have so many women, and I can't accept that. I want to be the only one, I can't stand sharing you. I hate you, she exclaimed, still holding on to him tightly. Vasper, hearing this, laughed and cried with joy, the tears streaming down his face as he squeezed her even tighter. Then, as if drawn together by an undeniable force, they pulled back slightly and shared a fervent kiss, their bodies igniting with passion, Vasper's groans filling the room. Chanty, I love you so much, I miss you so much, he repeated, but Chanty didn't respond with words, only soft moans as she kissed him back fervently. But when Vasper started to remove her clothes, Chanty seemed to wake up, stopping his hands and pulling away. She stepped back, stunned by what had just happened. Vasper, too, looked surprised by her reaction and approached her, but she stepped back again. Vasper, I'm sorry. I got carried away by my feelings. But nothing has changed in my decision, Jake is still the one I've chosen, Chanty said firmly, leaving Vasper as if doused in cold water. The joy he'd felt moments earlier shattered, replaced by a deep pain, the wound cutting even deeper. He said nothing, staring at her. Vasper, I don't want anything bad to happen to you. I'm sorry, but what I did earlier was just a fleeting moment. It can't continue. I'm married to Jake, Vasper. He is the man I chose to be with for the rest of my life. Vasper laughed bitterly, tears falling down his face. It feels like what you've just done hurts more than death, he said, turning and looking up at the ceiling, covering his face with his hand. Chanty's tears flowed as she watched him, pained by what she'd put him through. Vasper, I'm sorry, Chanty said, her voice shaking, and Vasper looked at her, tears streaming down his face. No, don't apologize, Chanty. You haven't wronged me in any way, he replied. I'm the one who's at fault for letting temptation guide me. Chanty cried harder, wanting to go to him but holding herself back. I understand your feelings. You chose to follow reason over your heart. You chose the safe and steady path with Jake over the difficult, thorny road with me, Vasper said, and Chanty just kept crying. Thank you for the brief moment of true happiness I felt, he said, putting his vest and gun back in the cabinet. Vasper's shoulders drooped, his expression darkening, the sorrow in his eyes weighing him down. In that moment, his world felt like it was cloaked in shadow, devoid of the light that had once guided him. His path ahead seemed lost, leaving him adrift in overwhelming grief. His legs felt numb, as though frozen in place, every step heavy and burdensome. When his eyes met Chanty's, she seemed so far away, an unreachable presence. He yearned to go to her, to wrap her in his arms, but his body felt paralyzed, like it was encased in ice, every movement weighted and drained of strength. Weak at the knees, he finally sank to the floor, overcome. Pain radiated through his chest with each breath he took, a suffocating ache that felt like it would crush him. Chanty was surprised by what he did. Vasper was now only in his shirt and pants. "We'll wait for them here," he said. In a tone so low and soft, as if he were whispering only to himself, sitting down on the floor with his head bowed. Chanty felt her heart ache, seeing Vasper crushed, feeling that the happiness she had given him had been ripped away so quickly. She watched him sitting on the floor, silent tears falling, wiping them away with his shirt. She wanted to rush toward Vasper, to hold him close and chase away the overwhelming sorrow that seemed to consume him. Her chest swelled with pity and a pang of guilt, haunted by the pain she had unwittingly caused him. Regret weighed heavily on her heart, knowing that she had given in to her emotions earlier. Now, watching him sit on the floor, heartbroken and lifeless, she felt as if a stone lay in her chest. "Vasper, I'm so sorry," she whispered through her tears, her voice trembling as she tried to hold back a sob. Vasper looked up at her in silence, his eyes sorrowful, glistening with unshed tears. Their gazes met, an unspoken conversation passing between them, thick with regret and grief. Then his eyes dropped back to the floor. Chanty bit her lip to suppress the cry that threatened to escape, turning her gaze quickly toward the curtains to avoid the agony of looking at him. Suddenly, they both felt a shift in energy around them, and a bright circle of light appeared on the wall. Chanty and Vasper looked at each other, and Jake emerged from the portal, flanked by 6 guardians and 3 verdant envoys. Like lightning, they seized Vasper, restraining him with a suspended necklace, but he did not resist. Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted as the envoy moved with lightning speed. Shocked, she watched as 2 verdant operatives each held one of Vasper's arms, with a third position just behind him. Vasper didn't even glance in her direction. The 6 guardians observed him with expressions of astonishment, their bodies tense and ready. Jake's gaze shifted to Chanty, his eyes filled with worry. Chanty, still crying, ran to Jake and embraced him tightly. Jake held her close, pressing a worried kiss to her lips, but Chanty did not respond to his kiss. She simply let him hold her. And Vasper was led away by the envoys. Jake asked Chanty in a worried tone, "Are you all right? Are you okay?" His voice held a sense of urgency, his eyes full of concern as he looked her over from head to toe. Chanty gave a small nod. "I'm okay, Jake, don't worry," she replied in a soft voice. "I'm so sorry it took us this long to find you," Jake said, remorse in his voice. Vasper used his invisible shield to hide his energy and aura, making it nearly impossible to detect him. His powers grown. His tone was filled with worry, and he brushed a gentle hand over her hair and face, watching her reaction carefully. Chanty, however, just held Jake tightly, clinging to the man she'd chosen to love and be with forever. Jake hugged her back firmly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I'm sorry, but we have to teach Vasper a lesson," Jake continued. "He's under Sylvan Concord's jurisdiction, and we'll have to imprison him there." Shocked, Chanty looked up at Jake, then at the 6 guardians standing nearby. David met her gaze with a serious expression. "Chanty, Vasper's actions broke Sylvan Concord law," David said in a grave tone. "He needs to serve time for his crimes." Jacob, meanwhile, observed Chanty with a gaze that seemed to read her emotions like an X-ray. The other guardians stood silent, listening and watching her response. Chanty remained quiet, simply holding on to Jake. But inside, worry gnawed at her. She couldn't help but feel concerned about what might happen to Vasper in the Sylvan Concord prison. The guardians looked around the room, and Justin moved toward the cabinets and drawers where Vasper had taken his weapons. Everyone's eyes followed as Justin opened the drawer, letting out a low whistle when he saw Vasper's collection of weaponry. Smiling slightly, he picked up a diamond bullet gun and showed it to the group. Jake's face turned serious as he examined the weapon. It was the same type of gun he'd once used against Vasper. Admiring the other weapons, Justin looked them over with a glint of appreciation. But David gave him a firm look. Enough, Justin. Put them back. It's time for us to go. Obediently, Justin returned the weapons and came to stand beside the group. Jake wrapped his arms around Chanty, and the 6 guardians laid a hand on his shoulder. In a blink, Jake teleported them all back to David's mansion. The hours drifted by, and Chanty found herself in the Verdant Envoy vehicle, ready to be transported to Sylvan Concord. She brought nothing with her, as everything she needed was already waiting at her sanctuary. Yet, Chanty couldn't stop crying as she looked into Jake's eyes. Both of them were weeping, speaking in whispers as if each word was their last exchange. Jake's lips lingered on Chanty's in a long, sorrowful kiss. They already missed each other even though they hadn't parted yet. "Take care of yourself there," Jake said, his voice laced with forced cheer. "Don't worry, you'll enjoy it. You'll meet new friends, and my cousins are there too." Chanty, eyes wet with tears, was surprised by this new information. "Really? Why are you only telling me this now?" she asked. "Sorry," Jake replied, "but it didn't seem like something big to mention. It's normal for us, and you'll eventually get to know the other guardian families there, especially the women. Didn't I tell you it's almost like a school there? Don't worry too much, you'll be busy, and before you know it, we'll be seeing each other again." He caressed her face with both hands, smiling softly. Chanty managed a weak smile in return. "Jake, listen to me, okay?" Chanty's voice was low but firm. "Don't go to the Twilight Reckoning. Let's wait until I finish my first year of vacation." Jake smiled but didn't reply immediately. "Promise me, Jake, don't go. Please, for me?" Chanty begged. "If I'm important to you, you won't go." Jake let out a weak laugh. "Chanty, if there's even a possibility of seeing you, I'll take it. I won't let the opportunity pass." He looked deeply into her eyes. "Even now, I already miss you." With that, he gently cupped her face and kissed her fervently, a passion Chanty returned in equal measure. "But Jake, I told David not to let you join them there." "Wait until I get back after a year," Chanty said with finality. Jake chuckled again. "Why won't you tell me about the prophecy of the Sword of Destiny, so I'll be prepared and cautious?" Jake asked, a hint of frustration in his tone. Chanty's gaze met his, sorrow clouding her eyes. "Because, in the vision I saw, he killed you, Jake. Alexander Mondragon's lightning bow struck you, that's why. Please, don't go." Chanty's words left Jake stunned, staring at her face in confusion, unsure of what he was feeling. Chanty embraced him tightly, feeling his body tense as they clung to each other and shared sorrow. "Please stay here, okay? Don't go. I'll take care of things," she urged. Jake gave her a gentle smile. "Don't worry, not every prophecy comes true," he replied. But Chanty's concern didn't ease. "Even so, Jake, it's better to avoid it. I can handle a year's separation for you, Jake, please, just do the same for me, okay?" Jake nodded reluctantly, sensing the urgency of their parting as the envoy stood beside them, signaling it was time for him to leave. Chanty held on to him one last time, their hands unwilling to let go. "Jake, I love you," Chanty whispered. "I love you more, my love." "I love you," he replied, finally releasing her hand with a heavy heart. Chanty continued crying silently as she watched Jake descend, aided by a floating device, though she wasn't sure how he was being lowered from the vehicle. Below, 6 guardians gathered to welcome him, all waving farewell in Chanty's direction. Tears still streamed down her face as she waved back, barely able to resist the urge to leap back to Jake and cancel her departure. But the envoy signaled, and in an instant, Jake was out of her sight, replaced by a new landscape below her. Chanty gasped, watching the scenery change as if they had teleported in a mere blink. She was awestruck when the doors opened, realizing they were in the inner world in less than a minute. She stepped out, marveling at her surroundings. Everything was bright and pristine, illuminated by radiant lights, and towering buildings surrounded her, reaching so high they seemed to touch the clouds. She couldn't even see their tops, and the architectural designs were unlike anything in the outer world. Vehicles soared above her, some floating close to the ground, while others sped through the air with incredible speed, leaving Chanty feeling as though she were in a dream. The entire scene around her was a wonderland, entirely different from anything she had ever seen. The light, too, was strange. Despite the absence of a visible sun, it was like an eternal afternoon, filled with a soft, warm glow. Curious, Chanty gazed around, noticing that most of the beings in the area were elves, though she did spot a few who looked human, which reminded her of what Jake had told her about the half-breeds. She looked down and noticed she was only dressed in joggers, while the other beings wore attire that resembled a high-fashion display. Embarrassed, Chanty stood still, suddenly feeling exposed as everyone's eyes fixed on her. Some smiled, some watched seriously, and others simply looked curious. Following the verdant envoy, she walked along an aisle, unsure where they were headed. She glanced back at the vehicle to see if Vasper, who had accompanied her but was confined in a separate room, had also disembarked. However, the circular flying object they had arrived in suddenly vanished, leaving her feeling a twinge of unease. But her surroundings were so captivating that she quickly became absorbed, taking in the sights she had never imagined possible in the outer world. As they approached a massive door, so large and thick that Chanty stared up at it in awe, she saw a group of elves gathered, all watching her intently. The verdant envoy pushed the door open, revealing a golden room beyond. Chanty's jaw dropped as she took in the opulence, a giant bed adorned in gold, golden curtains, and every furnishing in the room exuded luxury. She couldn't believe her eyes, especially when she noticed the windows looked like water. Puzzled, she glanced at the verdant envoy, who nodded and gestured that this was her room before exiting silently, leaving the giant door to close behind him. In stunned silence, Chanty took in the room's grandeur, staring up at the high ceiling. She felt like a tiny doll in the massive space. Curiosity got the best of her, and she explored the furniture, marveling at the sofa's softness and the bed's unimaginable comfort. The sheets were made from a fabric she had never touched before, soft beyond words. The bed was large enough for 10 people to sleep comfortably. She turned her attention to the window, drawn to its watery appearance. She reached out, astonished that her hand didn't get wet, yet she could push her hand through to the other side. Leaning forward, she poked her head out and was greeted by a vast garden with a lake at its center. Her heart swelled with amazement as she took in the beauty of the landscape, a paradise unlike anything she had ever seen, with flowers of every color and a fragrance that wafted through the air. Just then, she was startled by a knock on the door. The sound echoed through the room, and she called out, "Come in." The door opened, and 3 figures entered, 2 elves and 1 human-like woman with long white hair who smiled as she approached Chanty. Clad in a flowing white dress that concealed even her toes, revealing only her slender fingers and face, the woman before Chanty exuded an air of ethereal grace. The 2 elves accompanying her wore similar elegant attire. With a warm smile, the woman spoke, "Your Highness, welcome," her voice gentle yet regal, instantly comforting Chanty as she realized they spoke the same language. "You may call me Mara, and I, along with my companions, will be your servants. We are here to prepare you." "The king wishes to meet you," Mara continued, her tone both formal and inviting. Chanty's heart pounded with anxiety at the prospect, the weight of the moment sinking in. She glanced at herself, aware she carried no belongings and wore no grand attire. Sensing Chanty's unease, Mara offered a reassuring smile, then approached a nearby wall. To Chanty's amazement, Mara touched it lightly, and a massive, previously invisible room materialized, a vast walk-in closet filled with everything one could dream of, rows of shoes, shelves of bags, stunning garments, and even intricate jewelry sparkling under the light. "These are for you, Your Highness," Mara said. "Feel free to choose what you wish to wear for the meeting. The bath is always ready for you as well." She walked to another wall, repeating the same motion. Another hidden door slid open, revealing a luxurious golden bathroom. A grand bathtub gleamed at the center, surrounded by golden fixtures and tiles so immaculate they reflected like mirrors. Even the toilet bowl shimmered with a golden hue. Chanty's mouth fell open as she surveyed the opulence. Mara chuckled softly, gesturing to the servants who began filling the tub with water. The flow was so quiet it was nearly imperceptible. "If you need anything, Your Highness, use this," Mara said, handing Chanty a small, quail-egg-shaped device. "Just call my name, and I will come." Touched by their attentiveness, Chanty managed a small smile. "Thank you, Mara. I'll call you once I'm ready." "As you wish, Your Highness," Mara replied, bowing gracefully before signaling the elves to follow her out. As they reached the door, Chanty hesitated, her curiosity overpowering her. "Mara," she called softly. Mara turned, her ever-present smile lighting up her face. "Yes, Your Highness. I had a companion with me in the vehicle, a man." "Where was he taken?" Chanty asked, concern evident in her tone. Mara's expression turned somber as she hesitated briefly before answering. "He is in the prison, Your Highness. Vasper Mondragon." The weight of Mara's words hit Chanty hard. She nodded faintly, struggling to mask her unease. "I see. Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Mara bowed again before leaving the room, the door closing softly behind her. Left alone, Chanty approached the bathtub, her thoughts swirling. She undressed, her clothes pooling at her feet, and sank into the inviting warmth of the water. Whatever the elves had added to the bath created an intoxicating sense of calm. It seemed to rejuvenate her entire being, melting away the physical tension that clung to her body. The faint, floral fragrance enveloped the room, soothing her senses like a gentle lullaby. Despite the tranquility, her heart was heavy. Memories of Vasper consumed her thoughts, the torment etched on his face, the despair in his eyes. Hot tears began to stream down her cheeks as she whispered repeatedly, almost like a prayer, "I'm so sorry, Vasper." Her voice trembled with guilt, a deep ache clawing at her chest. She blamed herself for everything. Why had she approached Vasper in the first place? Why had she confessed her feelings? The choices she had made now seemed reckless, and they had led to this. Vasper locked away, bearing the consequences of their shared pain. Yet even in her sorrow, the image of Jake, her loving husband, surfaced in her mind. She missed him. "I miss you, Jake," she thought. Tears mixed with the bathwater as she pictured him back in their home, lounging by the pool with a beer in hand while she sipped tea. Her love for Jake was undeniable, yet Vasper's anguished face haunted her relentlessly. She dunked her head underwater, as if submerging herself would erase Vasper's image from her mind. An hour later, she emerged from the bath, refreshed yet emotionally drained. After dressing in a flowing gown from the closet, a masterpiece of craftsmanship, she called Mara using the device. Moments later, a knock echoed from the door. Mara entered with two elves, their expressions glowing with admiration for Chanty's beauty and her choice of attire. "If you're ready, Your Highness, we can proceed to the dining area," Mara said, bowing slightly. Chanty nodded with a polite smile, following them out of the room. As they walked, Chanty's gaze wandered, captivated by her surroundings. Vehicles zipped through the air above in a seamless dance, their designs sleek and unlike anything she had seen in the outer world. Despite the open feel of the area, Mara reassured her, "Your Highness, the surroundings are sealed with transparent walls and ceilings. You are perfectly safe here." Chanty marveled at the clarity of the air and the gentle breeze brushing her skin. She glanced at Mara with wide eyes. "How do you rest here? I mean, how do you relax without nightfall, like in the outer world?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. Mara smiled, her tone soft and kind. "We simply dim the lights, Your Highness. It's not complete darkness, but it's enough to rest peacefully." Chanty nodded thoughtfully. Soon, they arrived at a massive golden door adorned with intricate carvings. "Is everything here made of gold?" Chanty asked incredulously, unable to hide her awe. Mara chuckled. "Yes, Your Highness. It is real gold." Chanty was rendered speechless, her jaw dropping slightly as Mara pressed her palm against the door. It opened to reveal an enormous rectangular table surrounded by elegant chairs. Seated around it were breathtakingly beautiful women, each adorned with floral crowns and flowing gowns of delicate, ethereal fabrics. Chanty stepped forward, feeling as though she had walked into a dream. When Chanty saw the women in the room, they all stood and bowed in respect at her arrival. Embarrassed, she froze, her eyes fixed on their unmatched beauty. These women were youthful and elegant. However, Her gaze was particularly drawn to the king sitting at the head of the long, golden table. His crown gleamed, and even the chair he occupied was adorned with a regal crown motif. Chanty followed Mara's lead, bowing before the king. But as she raised her eyes, she was startled to find someone sitting beside him, Vasper Mondragon. His golden robe was striking, but it was his piercing gaze that unsettled her the most. He stared at her with such intensity that she felt as though she were the only person in the room. Her heart raced in confusion. Wasn't Vasper supposed to be imprisoned? Why was he seated so close to the king? Chanty hesitated before taking the seat Mara directed her to, which faced the king directly. Even as she sat down, her unease grew. The softness of the chair brought momentary comfort, but her eyes kept drifting back to Vasper. He wore a faint, knowing smile, his unwavering gaze fixed solely on her. It was as if he was devouring her with his eyes, and Chanty's cheeks burned under his scrutiny. She was so flustered that she barely noticed Mara quietly exiting the room. The king rose gracefully, his serene smile commanding attention. "Don Lorenzo. Welcome to my kingdom. Welcome to the Sylvan Concord," he said, gesturing for her to approach. His voice was soft, almost like a whisper carried on the wind, yet clear and commanding. One of the young women rose to guide Chanty forward, gently taking her hand. Her touch was impossibly soft, almost angelic, as she led Chanty closer to the king. As she approached, Chanty's nervousness spiked, especially with Vasper seated so close to the king. His eyes remained locked on her, intensifying the tumult in her chest. The king took her hand, and his touch was soothing, his skin warm and fragrant with an otherworldly scent she couldn't identify. To her surprise, her anxiety began to ebb away, replaced by a strange sense of calm. His emerald green eyes seemed to read her very soul as if he could see through her deepest thoughts. "Welcome to my kingdom, Don Lorenzo. I am Yelander Valener," the king said warmly. "Please don't worry about the 3 years you will spend here learning about our world. Everything you need is provided. I hope that by the end of your stay, your loyalty will remain with us." His presence radiated authority, yet his voice had an almost hypnotic gentleness that made his words resonate deeply. Chanty couldn't help but nod, managing a polite smile as she replied, "Thank you, Your Highness." The king smiled, lifting her hand to his lips in a chaste kiss before letting it go. Another woman stepped forward, taking Chanty's hand and guiding her back to her seat. Chanty's eyes flickered toward Vasper as she passed, and his gaze was as intense as ever. She quickly averted her eyes, unable to handle the weight of his stare. Once seated, Chanty noticed the woman who had guided her return to her place herself beside Vasper. To her surprise, the woman touched Vasper's thigh, drawing his attention. Chanty couldn't decipher the silent exchange between them, but her chest tightened uncomfortably. Soon, elves appeared in perfect synchronization, bringing food to the table. The feast spread before them was impressive, steaming dishes of fruits, vegetables, and meats Chanty couldn't identify. Their movements were precise, almost mechanical, as they filled the table with no errors or wasted effort. The king gestured elegantly, signaling the start of the meal, and everyone began eating in unison. Despite the feast's delicious aroma, Chanty found herself distracted. Her eyes drifted toward Vasper again, and their gazes locked once more. Startled, she looked away immediately, her heart pounding furiously. She tried to focus on the meal, but the tension in her chest made every bite taste bland. The woman sitting beside Vasper broke the silence. "Don Lorenzo," she called, her voice commanding Chanty's attention. Chanty turned to face her, momentarily stunned by her beauty. Unlike the elves, this woman had distinctly human features, though there was an elegance suggesting mixed heritage. "I am Lauren Valerian, cousin to Jake Valerian," she declared coldly. Chanty's eyes widened at the mention of Jake's name, her husband. Relief briefly washed over her. Finally, someone connected to her world. But Lauren's stern expression showed no warmth, no sign of joy at meeting Chanty. The king, observing the interaction, continued to smile as he ate, though his eyes flickered with quiet amusement. Chanty offered Lauren a small smile, but it quickly faltered when Lauren turned back to her plate, ignoring her completely. Lauren's hand moved subtly, resting on Vasper's arm. Chanty noticed their silent exchange of looks again, intense, wordless, and completely unreadable. Her chest ached as an unfamiliar emotion took root. Was it jealousy? Confusion? The king broke the silence with a curious remark. Vasper, you may choose anyone here to accompany you to your quarters as your attendant. His voice was calm, yet the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. Choose anyone to serve you. The king spoke, his tone generous yet commanding. Chanty's heart sank. She turned to look at the king in shock, then back at Vasper, who was now smiling faintly. His eyes met hers briefly before shifting to Lauren, who held his arm more firmly. Chanty's pulse quickened, and she dropped her gaze to her plate, unable to eat anymore. The feast continued, but Chanty's mind was in turmoil. She glanced discreetly at the women around her, wondering who they were. Were they the king's daughters? Why were they dining together? What would her role be in this strange kingdom? Her thoughts churned, questions multiplying as she tried to understand her place in this gilded yet enigmatic world. Vasper's gaze settled on Chanty, and said, I want her, Chanty, to serve me in my quarters, my king, if you allow it. Vasper declared, pointing directly at Chanty. His voice echoed through the dining area, clear and commanding, and the king seemed pleased with his request, nodding with approval. Chanty, however, froze. Her heart pounded violently as her wide eyes darted between Vasper and the king. She could hardly believe what was unfolding before her, unable to believe how Vasper had suddenly trapped her in this situation. Panic surged in her chest as she struggled to comprehend how to escape. Her gaze shifted to the women around the table, and among them, Lauren's face stood out, her expression sharp and angry as she stared at Chanty, sharp, cold, and unkind. My prince, this cannot be. She is my cousin's wife, protested Lauren, her voice firm in defiance of Vasper's wish. Vasper turned his head to Lauren, his lips curling into a smile that carried a subtle edge. Their marriage is invalid, Lauren, and you know that, Vasper replied, his smile unwavering, his tone unyielding. That carried a sharp undertone. Lauren's face tightened with displeasure as she glared at Chanty. But my king, Lauren pleaded, you know this cannot be. Chanty is the bearer of the sword of destiny. She cannot be alone with Vasper in his chambers. She cannot stay in Vasper's quarters, my king. Lauren's voice wavered, desperation evident in her tone and gestures. My prince, I am more than happy to serve you, she offered, her resolve slipping into eagerness, filled with desperation as she pleaded. The king turned to Chanty, her expression filled with confusion, as though she were trying to process everything. She seemed momentarily frozen in her seat, her mind spiraling with disbelief. The weight of the king's approving nod for Vasper's request struck her like a boulder. I thought Vasper was imprisoned? Chanty managed to ask, she stammered, confusion thick in her voice. Confusion and fear lacing her voice as she wondered why Vasper was seated next to the king and even allowed to request such things. What was the meaning of this? She realized Vasper had outmaneuvered them, and even Jake, her husband, seemed unaware of what was happening. Chanty's body trembled in fear, dreading what Vasper might do if they were alone in his quarters. She didn't want to relive the mistakes of the past, actions she had regretted deeply. The king smiled at Chanty. Yes, he was taken to prison, but he negotiated with our kingdom in the name of his father, Alexander Mondragon. He is the future heir to the kingdom of Velantis Noctem. This agreement is crucial for the well-being of everyone in the inner world. This alliance is more important than any punishment, for it ensures the welfare of all who dwell here in the inner world. Vasper pledged to honor our terms, provided we grant his requests, which I see are not unreasonable, the king explained with a smile. Chanty's fear intensified. Did this mean Vasper was now free? Could he do whatever he wanted? Her hands shook as she held her spoon, while the other women around the table, including Lauren, who still glared sharply at her, watched her every move. Vasper, meanwhile, had grown serious, his earlier smile fading. The king noticed Chanty's pale face and gestured to his servants. 2 elven attendants approached Chanty and checked her pulse. She glanced at Vasper, her stare cold and accusing, her voice caught in her throat. Chanty stared at Vasper, her gaze sharp with disbelief at how he had manipulated the situation to his advantage, bending even the king's will, manipulating even the king to align with his desires. "She's fine," the elves reported, bowing slightly before retreating. The king smiled once again at Chanty, but Vasper's gaze remained stern. Chanty's hands trembled as she felt the weight of the room pressing on her. Lauren, too, glanced between Chanty and Vasper, her expression unreadable. "Very well," the king declared, addressing the room. "Vasper may take Chanty, but she will be accompanied by Lauren and Niana," the king finally said. Chanty's heart sank upon hearing this, feeling as though the king and Vasper had conspired against her. "No, this can't happen," Chanty protested silently in her mind, though her lips remained sealed. Yet Vasper smiled in gratitude at the king. "My king," Chanty said, struggling to keep her voice calm, though it wavered. Vasper's serious gaze turned to her as she asked, "May I see my husband, Jake Valerian?" Chanty asked, her voice shaking, her throat tight with unshed tears. Vasper's expression darkened further. Around the table, the others resumed eating as if nothing unusual had occurred. The king smiled. "There's no reason to summon the guardians, and besides, Jake Valerian is no longer recognized as one of them. He is not allowed to return to this kingdom. He may tread upon other lands, but not here. He has no right to step foot in my kingdom. He may set foot elsewhere, but not here." Chanty's world shattered at those words. Despair weighed down on her, making her feel as though the ground beneath her had disappeared. Across the table, Vasper's smile grew sharper, cutting into her like a blade. Lauren lowered her head, continuing her meal in silence. "Let us finish eating," the king commanded, "and later we shall finalize the details of Vasper Mondragon's request." The king instructed, his voice carrying a tone that silenced everyone at the large table. The women seated around the large table obeyed, silently continuing their meal. No one dared speak until the plates were cleared and the table was cleaned by the elves. Around 12 women, including Chanty, sat in quiet submission. The king remained seated, his commanding presence keeping everyone in place. And out of respect, Chanty wanted nothing more than to stand and leave, to retreat to her chambers, but out of respect for the king, she stayed rooted in her chair. Are the women here? Was their purpose merely to serve the king's guests? Chanty wondered bitterly. Is that why they're so beautiful, so perfect in every way? To be offered to visiting dignitaries? To be offered as entertainment to visitors? And why was she included? Did this mean she was part of this service too? Her self-worth felt crushed under the weight of that thought. Her gaze burned with indignation as it met Vasper's, whose expression remained stern, his gaze unchanging as he looked at her. The king began to speak again. "Lauren and Niana, you will accompany Chanty to serve the Prince of Velantis," he commanded, his voice brooking no defiance. Lauren and Niana smiled as they looked at Vasper, though Lauren's gaze toward Chanty remained unfriendly. Finally, the king rose from his chair, signaling the end of the meal. His personal servants attended him, and he left through a different pathway. The other women at the table also stood and began to leave, but Lauren and Niana stayed behind, waiting to follow Vasper. When Vasper approached Chanty, she stood abruptly, her anger flaring. Without warning, Chanty slapped him hard across the face. Vasper didn't flinch. His head barely moved from the force of Chanty's slap. Lauren and Niana were stunned by what they saw. The Prince of Velantis had been slapped. Lauren and Niana gasped, their shock evident as they watched the Prince of Velantis get struck. Chanty's gaze was filled with rage. Chanty's glare bore into Vasper, her eyes blazing with fury as tears streamed down her face. "You're despicable. How dare you manipulate everyone and twist the situation to your favor, Vasper?" Chanty spat, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You manipulate everything to your advantage," she shouted, but her voice quivering. Vasper grabbed her waist, pulling her close until their faces were mere inches apart. "I will do whatever it takes to reclaim what is rightfully mine," Vasper declared, his tone resolute, final, and cold as steel. Chanty glared at him, her breath hitched as she stared into his intense gaze. Her body trembled, torn between fear and defiance, yet she couldn't move under his firm grip. Lauren hurried forward, her voice breaking with worry. My prince. What do you want us to do for you? Are you okay? She asked, stepping closer and looking at the red mark on Vasper's cheek where Chanty's hand had struck. Both Chanty and Vasper turned their gazes to Lauren at the same time. Chanty's expression was one of confusion, while Vasper's face remained stoic. Chanty pushed Vasper away, and he released her slowly. Leave, Vasper ordered curtly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Lauren froze, stunned by his command. Niana, take Lauren out of here. I don't need your services. Chanty is the one I requested, Vasper said, his words directed sharply at Lauren. Chanty was shocked, staring at Lauren, whose expression changed as though she were about to cry. My prince, don't you want me? Lauren's voice trembled, hurt evident in her words. To her, serving Vasper Mondragon was her ultimate goal, the reason she had entered the Sylvan Concord in the first place. My prince, even my soul, I'll offer it to you. I'll do anything, Lauren said, her desperation evident. Whatever you need, I will do it. Lauren's voice grew desperate, her body trembling as she tried to convey her devotion. Chanty's eyes burned with disdain as she watched Lauren degrade herself before Vasper. She stared at Lauren feeling concerned and pity all at once. But Vasper's expression didn't change. His voice remained cold and firm. You heard me, Lauren. I don't need your services, he repeated, his gaze unwavering as he looked directly into Lauren's eyes. Niana approached Lauren, gently taking Lauren's hand, urging her to leave. Come on, Lauren, let's go, Niana urged, trying to lead her away. Lauren, however, refused to move. She stood rooted in place, tears streaming down her cheeks as she stared at Vasper. My prince, you are the reason I'm here in the Sylvan Concord. I've saved myself, kept myself pure, just for you, Lauren confessed, her voice shaking with a mix of sadness and shame. I'm yours, my prince. Until now, I've remained a virgin just for you, her voice trembling. Chanty was shocked, her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing, unable to believe what she had just heard from Lauren's lips. Lauren had fallen for Vasper's charm and allure to this extent? Chanty turned away, embarrassed and confused by the situation, overwhelmed by the scene. She turned her back, intending to leave. But before she could take a step, Vasper's hand shot out, gripping her wrist tightly. Lauren's gaze dropped to where Vasper's hand held Chanty, her expression a mix of heartbreak and disbelief. Chanty tried to pull her hand free. She tugged at her wrist, trying to free herself. Let me go, Vasper, she demanded, her voice rising, but Vasper didn't let go. Niana held on to Lauren, who seemed frozen in despair. Vasper dragged Chanty out of the dining area. Lauren and Niana remained behind, watching the scene unfold in stunned silence. Where is he taking her? Niana whispered, her voice filled with uncertainty. Lauren's sharp gaze followed Vasper and Chanty until they disappeared from view. Her chest burned with jealousy and anger. Vasper and Chanty walked toward a large door near Chanty's chamber. Chanty followed reluctantly, her eyes darting back to see Lauren watching them leave with a sharp glare. Chanty struggled to free her hand. Vasper, let me go, she demanded. Instead, Vasper picked her up and carried her, ignoring her protests. Vasper, put me down, she cried as Vasper carrying her effortlessly toward his chambers. Lauren and Niana watched in shock as he carried Chanty into his room. Lauren gasped and rushed after them. Chanty saw her approaching and began struggling harder against Vasper. Lauren ran after them, and Chanty hit Vasper's back repeatedly. Vasper, put me down. Lauren is coming. Chanty shouted, her voice tinged with panic. But Vasper ignored her cries, continuing to stride purposefully toward his room. Reaching the door, he set Chanty down gently, brushing stray locks of hair from her face and adjusting her clothes with care. He opened the door, intending to step inside with Chanty when Lauren's voice rang out behind them. My prince! Lauren called, her voice shaking with desperation. Both Chanty and Vasper turned to face her. Lauren's expression was anguished, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Who looked on the verge of tears. Chanty, what about Jake? In the outer world, your marriage is legal. Lauren's voice broke as she shouted. And the sword of destiny, it will lose its power if... Lauren's voice faltered, but her meaning was clear. If you let the prince touch you. Chanty froze, finally understanding Lauren's warning. Her chest tightened. Don't worry, Lauren. That won't happen, Chanty replied firmly, though her voice betrayed the storm of emotions inside her. Yes, Vasper added, his tone cold and resolute. Not until Chanty wants me to. Vasper said firmly, until the twilight reckoning is complete. With that, Vasper pulled Chanty. She had no choice. Vasper lifted her off the ground and carried her inside. Left behind, Lauren stood outside the door. Leaving her standing, despair etched across her face. Vasper shut the door behind them, the sound echoing in the hallway. Lauren, heavy-footed, turned and walked back to Aniana, her spirit crushed. Aniana embraced her tightly as Lauren broke down, tears streaming from the overwhelming turmoil in her heart. He doesn't want me. After everything, he doesn't want me, Lauren whispered, her voice breaking. Niana embraced her, offering silent comfort as Lauren's sobs echoed down the hall. Vasper didn't even acknowledge her beauty? Even though many princes desired her? She had rejected all of them, waiting for Vasper Mondragon. She wanted him to be the one she offered her virginity to. The light in the surroundings dimmed, signaling that it was time for rest in the inner world. Meanwhile, inside the room, Vasper and Chanty were still struggling on the bed. Chanty refused to let Vasper hold her as they slept together. Chanty, please. I won't do anything. Just let me cuddle you, that's all I want, Vasper pleaded. But Chanty was already crying, looking helplessly at Vasper as he hovered above her. Vasper, you know I'm married. I have a husband. How would he feel if he found out what you're doing to me? That you're lying here beside me? You have no conscience, Vasper. You have no respect for me. Chanty said amidst her sobs. Vasper gazed at her with pain in his eyes. From the beginning, you were mine, Chanty. We were supposed to be married, not you and Jake, Vasper replied. You were the first to betray me, Vasper, you. Chanty shouted, still struggling to free herself from Vasper's hold. But his grip only tightened. Why can't you follow your heart, Chanty? Why won't you fight for your love for me? Why am I the only one fighting for us? Vasper asked, his voice breaking. The room fell silent. Both of them became still as statues, their eyes speaking in place of words. Vasper's gaze dropped to Chanty's lips. Your pity for Jake is different from the love you feel for me. Love is not the same as pity, Chanty, Vasper continued in a low voice. Chanty's lips quivered as she responded. I love him, Vasper. I love my husband, and I already miss him. I want to go home, Chanty said as tears fell harder from her eyes. I love my husband. I want to go home with him, she repeated, her voice breaking as she cried harder. Her words struck Vasper like a blow. The pity I feel is for you, Vasper. I still care about you, but it ends there. The love I once had for you, I've worked hard to forget it. I chose Jake, and he's the one who owns my heart and body now, she added. Vasper's red, teary eyes looked at her, his lips trembling. But my whole life is with you, Chanty. How can I live without you? You still love me, please, come back to me. Let's start over. Forget everything else, Vasper begged, caressing Chanty's cheek and hair. But Chanty's tears only flowed more freely. Vasper, I don't know how else to make you understand. My decision is final. I choose Jake. Please, accept it, I beg you, Chanty said, her voice filled with plea. Vasper's expression suddenly turned serious. No. I will annul your marriage, he declared. Chanty froze, her eyes wide as she stared at Vasper. No one can annul my marriage to Jake, she said firmly, her tone sharp. Vasper smirked bitterly. Watch me. In the coming days, you'll receive the annulment notice for your marriage to Jake. He will, too, on the day before the twilight reckoning, Vasper replied. Chanty's eyes blazed. Didn't you ask the king to let him come here? Don't worry. Jake will arrive the day before the twilight reckoning, Vasper said, his gaze unwavering. Chanty stared at him, feeling as if her entire body had turned cold. Vasper, what are you planning? I will never forgive you for manipulating our lives, she said in a low tone, her voice laced with warning. Everything I'm doing is for you, for us, Chanty. This is my fight for you. I won't let Jake steal what's mine, Vasper said, his voice full of bitterness and determination. Chanty struggled again, but she couldn't break free. You're the reason I left you, Vasper. You betrayed me on the day of our wedding. I saw your infidelity with my own eyes, Chanty said, her voice trembling as the pain of the past resurfaced. I've already admitted my mistake, Chanty. I confessed everything to you, but you didn't believe me. I've tried to fix it all, but you were the one who left me. I never gave up on you, I fought for you. I just wanted you to fight for me, too, even a little, Vasper replied, his voice broken. What was there to fight for, Vasper? You had Samara. You got her pregnant. I'm not like you, who can juggle multiple relationships. Then there's Anastasia, how many others are there? I can't live like that, Vasper. Find someone who can accept your lifestyle, but it's not me, Chanty said. My life with Jake is peaceful. You're the one who's bringing chaos into our marriage, she added. Vasper laughed bitterly. Is it my fault that they're drawn to me? That's just how my life has always been, Chanty. But now, it's different. I've changed. You're the only one I want to be with, no one else, Vasper pleaded. Is that so? Then why did you and Samara do it on the bed? I saw it with my own eyes. The pain, Vasper. The pain of what you did. It's like a nightmare I can't escape. It haunts me even in my sleep, Chanty cried. Vasper felt the weight of Chanty's anguish, mirroring the pain he had felt when he saw her with Jake. I'm so sorry. I understand your pain because it's the same pain I felt when I saw you with Jake, Vasper said, his voice trembling. My situation is different from yours, Vasper. Jake and I are married. Back then, when I saw you, we were supposed to get married. Do you even know how painful that was for me? Samara, then there was Anastasia, and now. Lauren. Direct your feelings toward them so you can give me peace of mind. And there's also Clarissa, Chanty said with a scoff. With so many women wanting you, I'd never have peace of mind if you were my husband, she added firmly. You sound jealous, Vasper said with a slight smirk, but Chanty shot him a sharp glare. I don't care, Vasper, how many women likes you. We have no relationship. So, please, can you leave? I can't breathe properly because of your weight, Chanty replied. Struggling to free herself from Vasper's body. Vasper shifted his weight, leaning on his elbow on the mattress. Tomorrow, I'll get some magic wine so you can experience what Samara made me drink. I want you to understand my situation, why I ended up like that. But it's still my fault, Chanty, Vasper said softly. Don't involve me in your madness, Vasper. Enough. Just leave, Chanty said as she pushed against his chest, but Vasper wouldn't budge. Instead, Vasper rolled to his side, pulling Chanty along with him. He wrapped his arms tightly around her as they lay on their sides. Go to sleep. Tomorrow, you'll be busy with your activities, Vasper said, his voice calm as he held Chanty firmly in his arms. Vasper, let me go. Chanty protested, struggling to break free. If you don't stay still, I'll kiss you, just one more time, Vasper warned, his tone firm. Fearful of causing a commotion, Chanty froze. Minutes passed. Slowly, she tilted her head to look at Vasper's face, only to see that his eyes were closed. But his hold on her was so tight she couldn't move an inch. Chanty's eyes remained wide open as she lay there, forcing herself not to sleep. She was terrified of what Vasper might do to her. Time passed, and Vasper's grip on her didn't loosen. Chanty kept trying to push him away, but every time she did, his hold only tightened further. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her. Her eyes surrendered, and she fell into a deep sleep, her strength completely drained from her struggles. Vasper smiled when he noticed she had finally fallen asleep. He did nothing but gaze at Chanty's sleeping face, his eyes drinking in the sight of her beside him. This was the woman who owned his entire being, his body, heart, and even his soul. She was the one who brought him true happiness. "I'll do whatever it takes to take you back from Jake," Vasper murmured. He leaned down and placed a soft kiss on Chanty's lips. She didn't feel it, her sleep was deep and peaceful. "I love you so much, Don Lorenzo. You belong to me alone. I'll take you back from Jake." "That's my promise," Vasper whispered. Then, he closed his eyes and fell asleep, holding Chanty tightly in his arms. Morning had arrived in the inner world, marking Chanty's first 24 hours in this new realm of sylvan concord. However, the man beside her, Vasper Mondragon, had already awakened. He inhaled deeply, savoring the sight of Chanty, who was still sound asleep, as though drained from the events of the previous day. Vasper watched Chanty's sleeping face, his heart filled with a bittersweet mix of pain and joy. Though she was right before him, he had no right to kiss or hold her, not without forcing her to allow him to do so. He longed for the day when Chanty would willingly embrace and kiss him again, just like they used to in the outer world, back when they were together and their relationship was still intact. Now, his determination to win her back from Jake had not wavered. It had only grown stronger, fueled by the moment when Chanty admitted that she still loved him, but chose to stay with Jake, to love and be with him instead. To Vasper, it felt like he was the unluckiest man in the world. How could he have lost the woman who once loved him without limit? How had he managed to destroy Chanty's trust and love for him, all because of the magic wine? He raked his fingers through his hair in frustration, haunted by memories that brought unbearable pain and regret, memories of his life with Chanty and the chapter of his life he had ruined. If only he could turn back time. If only he could erase Chanty's painful memories of him. Slowly, Vasper leaned closer to Chanty's forehead, intending to kiss it softly. But before he could, a knock came at the door. He panicked, glancing at Chanty, worried that she might wake up. Carefully, he climbed off the bed, taking great care not to disturb it. He hurried to the door and opened it, revealing two elves holding breakfast trays that floated in the air, a result of their telekinetic abilities. However, to his surprise, Lauren stood among them, her expression serious as she looked at him. "My prince, here is your breakfast," Lauren said with a slight bow. Lauren wore a flowing dress that reached her toes, but its neckline was quite revealing, showing off her cleavage and the beauty of her bust. Her hair was adorned with floral decorations, enhancing her elegant appearance. Lauren's eyes reflected her affection for Vasper, and she smiled sweetly at him. Her gestures were confident, as though flaunting her charm before him, a charm admired by princes from other kingdoms in the inner world. But Vasper's expression remained stoic. Though he wasn't oblivious to Lauren's intentions, he didn't react. Lauren entered the room with the elves, who arranged the breakfast trays on the table Vasper had prepared for himself and Chanty. However, Lauren's gaze drifted toward Vasper's bed, where Chanty was still sound asleep, undisturbed by their noise. Lauren's expression changed. Her eyes narrowed as she stared at the sleeping beauty on Vasper's bed. She couldn't help but imagine what Vasper might have done with Chanty, who was, after all, her cousin's wife. Lauren approached Chanty, intending to wake her up, but Vasper quickly stepped forward and grabbed her arm. Their eyes locked, tension filling the room. Lauren's gaze shifted to Vasper's hand on her arm. The warmth of his touch sent a spark through her, making her body tingle. "Don't wake her," Vasper commanded. Lauren's face tightened, clearly displeased. Vasper released her arm and turned to the elves. "Leave. I'll call for you once we're done eating," Vasper instructed. The two elves immediately exited without waiting for Lauren, who lingered in the room. She glanced between Chanty and Vasper, her thoughts a mix of confusion and jealousy. "It's time for the golden bath. She needs to join the scheduled training today, my prince," Lauren said softly. Vasper nodded. "I know. I'll personally take her there," he replied. Lauren's eyes widened in disbelief. The Prince of Velantis himself would escort Chanty to the golden bath. Jealousy began to stir within her. "Please, leave now," Vasper said gently, careful not to offend Lauren. But Lauren was already upset. Her gaze turned back to Chanty, who was now awake and staring at them. For a moment, all three of them froze, exchanging glances. Chanty, embarrassed to be caught sleeping in another man's bed, especially by her husband's cousin, quickly got off the bed. She circled around the bed and headed for the door. "I'm so sorry for waking up late," Chanty said, bowing her head in shame to Lauren as she walked toward the door. But Vasper was quick. He grabbed Chanty by the waist, stopping her. "No. Don't leave. Stay here and eat with me." "Breakfast just arrived," Vasper said firmly. Lauren was stunned by Vasper's bold gesture. Jealousy and anger brewed within her, her emotions conflicted. Chanty struggled to free herself from Vasper's grasp but couldn't break free. "Did you forget? You're supposed to serve me. Why are you leaving me here? Should I report you to the king?" Vasper teased, his tone playful yet firm. Chanty froze, remembering Vasper's request and fearing the king's judgment. She glared at Vasper, then turned to Lauren, who now exuded an unfriendly aura toward her. "Vasper, Lauren is here. Can she take over for me? I need to take care of something in my room," Chanty pleaded, trying again to remove Vasper's arm from her waist, but it was futile. Lauren's eyes darted between Vasper and Chanty, particularly to Vasper's arm around Chanty's waist. "Are you sure nothing happened between the two of you?" Lauren asked softly, her tone tinged with doubt. Suddenly, Chanty summoned the Sword of Destiny in her right hand, a symbol of her purity. The blade glowed red, its energy radiating from its center. Lauren gasped in shock. "Chanty! The Sword of Destiny demands blood," she exclaimed, recognizing the meaning behind the sword's color. Chanty stared at the sword in disbelief, its crimson glow confirming the truth. Panicked, she willed the sword to disappear, and it vanished from her hand. Vasper's eyes met Lauren's, their gazes intense with unspoken thoughts. "Lauren, get out." Vasper's tone was firm, leaving no room for argument. Lauren hurried out of the room, her face showing a hint of tears. Once the door closed behind her, Vasper finally released Chanty from his grip. Chanty turned to him, her eyes blazing with anger. "Vasper, why did you send Lauren away? She was supposed to take my place here. I was heading back to my room. There's no need for her to stay here, I can handle myself," Vasper snapped, his tone icy. Vasper's expression remained calm but intense. "Do you even know what she wants?" he asked, his voice carrying a sharp edge. "She wants me to take her virginity." Chanty froze at his words, her eyes widening in shock. Her lips parted slightly, as if trying to form a response, but no words came. Vasper gestured for her to sit. "Here. Sit down and eat," he said as he prepared a plate of food for her. Still dazed, Chanty reluctantly sat down, and Vasper joined her. He placed the plate in front of her and began eating his meal. "Vasper, I want to go home," Chanty said, her voice breaking, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't want to stay here. I don't like it here." Her words stopped Vasper mid-bite. He looked at her, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "Why?" he asked, his voice cold. "Why were those women at the table with you yesterday? And what is Lauren's purpose here in Sylvan Concord?" Vasper remained silent, his eyes fixed on her. "Answer me, Vasper. Why are there so many women here? Is it because of your traditions?" Chanty's voice was strained, her frustration spilling out. Taking a deep breath, Vasper finally spoke. "Don't worry, you're not like them. I personally requested your presence at the table yesterday. Your rules here are different from Lauren's. They're destined for kings and princes. They can become wives or mistresses. Every king here is allowed 5 wives, but only 1 queen." Chanty's eyes widened further as she listened, each word sinking into her heart like a stone. The realization of Sylvan Concord's traditions made her feel even more out of place. So you mean, you have many women? Chanty asked, her voice barely above a whisper, tears brimming in her eyes. She stared at her plate, wiping her tears with a trembling hand. No. Vasper's voice was resolute. You're the only one I want as my queen. When I become king, I'll change the tradition. There will only be one wife, one queen, just you. He smiled as he reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her rejection clear. I will not be your queen, Vasper, she said firmly. I belong in the outer world, not here. I don't want to stay in this place. Her defiance only fueled his determination. That's why I chose the outer world too, Chanty. We'll live there together. Don't worry. We'll have children, grandchildren, we'll grow old together. Chanty's mind drifted to thoughts of Jake. Her heart ached, tears falling silently as she remembered their dreams of building a life together. She stayed silent, forcing herself to eat to avoid further confrontation. I'll take you to your golden bath before your training today, Vasper said, trying to shift the focus to her daily activities. I have my assistant, Mara, Chanty replied, hoping to dissuade him. Well, not today. I'll accompany you myself. That's the king's decree, Vasper said with a calm yet unyielding smile. Chanty's head shot up in shock. Vasper, you can't just decide everything for me. Can't you leave me alone? It's unfair to my husband that you're always hovering around me. She stood abruptly, anger flaring in her tone. Vasper rose as well, closing the space between them. His impossibly handsome face, a face that had once tempted her, was now the source of her frustration. His charm, the one that captivated so many women like Lauren, Clarissa, and countless others, was the same thing she despised most about him now. Why, Chanty? Are you afraid that spending every day with me will make you love me even more? Vasper asked, his voice soft yet laced with challenge. She glared at him, her fiery gaze meeting his unwavering eyes. How long will you keep denying your feelings? How long will you fight against the desires of your heart and body? He whispered as he stepped closer, his body brushing against hers. Let me go, Vasper. Chanty yelled, twisting in his firm grasp, avoiding his piercing gaze. Her eyes darted toward the table filled with untouched food. You're the most cowardly person I know, Chanty, Vasper said, his tone a mix of frustration and longing. You're so scared of admitting your own feelings that you'd rather leave me, even after seeing how hard I've fought for you. I've stayed by your side, even when you let me go. Enough, Vasper. There's no point in bringing up the past. I'm married now, and you already have a child with Samara. Just stop. Chanty shouted, desperation evident in her voice. But Vasper wasn't finished. Sit down. Finish your meal. We'll talk again after your activity, he ordered as he gently but firmly guided her back to her chair. I'm full, Chanty protested, standing her ground. I need to go back to my room. I have things to take care of. Without warning, Vasper pulled her into another embrace. You'll eat, or I'll kiss you, he growled, his voice low and commanding. Chanty froze, the ultimatum catching her off guard. She slid back into her seat, reluctantly picking at her food. Vasper returned to his place across the table, his gaze never leaving her face as he resumed eating. Chanty focused on the fruits on her plate, avoiding the meat as she didn't know what kind it was. All the while, Vasper watched her, his expression stern, his determination unwavering. This is mammoth meat, Vasper said, gazing at Chanty as he pierced a piece of tender meat with his fork. It's delicious, you should try it, he added. Mammoths are rare here in the inner world, and it's a privilege to have their meat, Vasper explained further. Chanty, however, simply stared at the meat before turning her attention back to her fruit plate, refusing to speak or engage. You don't need to return to your room to bathe, Vasper began. At the golden bath, you'll bathe in melted gold mixed with honey and milk. Chanty's eyes widened in disbelief as she looked at him, prompting Vasper to laugh. Yes, literally, he confirmed. It helps maintain your youthful beauty and skin texture. That's the routine here for women like Lauren, and you, he added, trying to reassure her. Minutes passed in silence, with Chanty focused solely on her food, while Vasper's gaze never left her. When they finished eating, they stepped out of the room and found a sleek circular vehicle waiting to take them to Chanty's golden bath. Outside stood Mara and two elves, still and quiet. Chanty's face lit up at the sight of Mara, finally relieved to have someone besides Vasper around. However, her joy turned to confusion when Vasper approached Mara and the elves, gesturing for them to leave. As they walked away, Chanty frowned. "I'll take care of you." "Get in," Vasper instructed, extending his arm toward the vehicle. Hesitantly, Chanty climbed into the soft, sofa-like seat inside. The interior was pristine white, and Chanty couldn't see the driver. Vasper reached for her hand, but she quickly pulled it away. He gave her a stern look but didn't push further. The vehicle doors closed, and Chanty suddenly felt the energy shift. Moments later, the doors reopened, revealing their destination. Despite the vehicle's speed, Chanty remained silent, though the teleportation-like experience surprised her. "This vehicle can teleport, just like Jake and I can," Vasper said, breaking the silence. "Only the Sylvan Concord owns such vehicles in all the realms. My father has one in the inner world, but he's restricted to Velantis." Chanty, disinterested in his explanation, stepped out of the vehicle without a word. What lay before her was breathtaking, a massive resort-like facility nestled on a desert island, encased within a crystalline dome similar to her sanctuary. The vast area was filled with beautiful women bathing in the golden liquid Vasper had described, their nudity hidden only by the shimmering gold. Chanty flushed, averting her eyes. "Why are they all naked? And why are there men here?" Chanty asked, her voice laced with discomfort. Vasper chuckled. "Don't worry. If a woman here is chosen by a man, it means she's already his wife or mistress. There are strict rules. I have no intention of touching them," he reassured her, pointing toward a lounging elf man nearby. "Look there. Some royal men wait here, too, princes or kings. Only they can enter. No one else." Chanty held her shock in check, muttering under her breath, "I hate this world." Vasper heard her and chuckled softly. They walked further, and Chanty's unease grew when she spotted Lauren standing naked in a hallway, her body not yet covered in the golden liquid. Chanty's heart raced as she glanced nervously at Vasper, who briefly looked at Lauren with a stern expression before pulling Chanty along. Lauren greeted Vasper, her voice filled with pride as she stood confidently before him. Chanty couldn't help but admire Lauren's perfect, goddess-like figure, though jealousy and panic stirred within her. Vasper merely nodded at Lauren and led Chanty forward, his hand gripping hers firmly. Lauren's gaze followed them, her jealousy palpable. "Jake needs to know about Chanty's betrayal here in Sylvan Concord," Lauren whispered to herself. Once Vasper and Chanty were out of sight, Lauren's confidence crumbled. She thought of Vasper's expression when he looked at her. It had shown no trace of admiration for her beauty. Tears welled in her eyes as she entered the pool, immersing herself in the warm, soothing liquid gold, hoping it could ease the storm in her heart. Meanwhile, Chanty hesitated at the thought of undressing. The lack of privacy unsettled her. "Why are the women here so comfortable being seen by men while naked?" she wondered aloud, looking at her reflection in a large mirror. Knowing Vasper waited outside the room, she scanned for another exit to escape, but there was none. Women of various races entered the room, their flawless skin mesmerizing Chanty. She admired their beauty and confidence but couldn't bring herself to join them. The women began undressing, completely at ease with their nudity, while Chanty leaned against the wall, conflicted. She felt self-conscious, wondering how Vasper might be enjoying the view outside. Finally, she decided against disrobing, unwilling to expose herself. Chanty left the room, meeting Vasper, who looked at her in surprise. "I'm not bathing." "Let's go home," she said, her face a mixture of discomfort and defiance. "I can't do this. I can't be naked where other men might see me. This isn't my world," she added, her voice firm but her discomfort clear. Vasper chuckled softly at her indignation. "It's normal here, there's no malice in it," he said, standing and facing her. "You need this bath. The training you'll undergo later is tough. This will strengthen your body, he explained. Try it. You can keep your underwear on, he suggested. Still, Chanty refused. If I'd known it was like this, I wouldn't have come here. I want a normal bath, not this, she retorted, her frustration evident. Vasper said nothing, understanding Chanty's unease but determined to help her. He knew the golden bath's healing properties were essential for her well-being. Vasper instructed, "Wait here, I'll talk to the staff," before heading to a room where the female elves worked, leaving Chanty waiting outside. When Vasper returned, he was accompanied by 2 elves, motioning for her to follow them. Vasper smiled as he approached Chanty, taking her hand to guide her. However, Chanty pulled her hand away, leaving Vasper silent but understanding. They followed the elves quietly until they reached a large room with a pool of golden liquid at its center. Vasper conversed with the elves in their tongue before they exited, leaving only Chanty and him. "You'll be alone here," Vasper said. Chanty, curious, gazed at the golden liquid, her senses soothed by the room's floral scents. 30 minutes is enough for this, Vasper added. Chanty gestured toward the door, signaling for him to leave. "I've seen everything about you, what are you still embarrassed about?" Vasper teased. "I've held you, touched every part of you, yet you still act shy around me?" Embarrassed, Chanty's cheeks flushed red. "Thanks, but I'm not bathing," she retorted, walking toward the door. Before she could exit, Vasper caught her waist effortlessly. "So quick to get upset," he teased. "All right, I'm leaving." Vasper looked at her one last time before stepping out. Chanty promptly locked the door behind him. The room resembled a clay cave illuminated by warm lights akin to large candles. Alone, Chanty undressed, placing her clothes on a chair, and submerged herself in the golden liquid. Its warmth enveloped her skin, a comforting sensation that climbed up to her neck. She noticed how it clung to her skin, tightening and rejuvenating her body. Curious, she applied some to her face before fully submerging herself. Emerging with a laugh, she marveled, "They bathe in gold here? In the outer world, people fight over it, yet here it's so abundant." Understanding now why Vasper and the Guardians were so wealthy, she felt off with the Sylvan Concord's riches. After a few more minutes, she finished her bath, dried herself, and donned a golden silk bathrobe. When she exited, Vasper stood waiting with a smile. "I didn't bring extra clothes, so I'll wear this for now," Chanty explained. Vasper smiled warmly. "All right, let's head back." Chanty followed, clutching her bathrobe. As they walked, Vasper tried to hold her hand, but Chanty distanced herself. Soon, they encountered Lauren, whose body glistened with golden liquid. Chanty's heart raced, but she had something to say to Lauren. Despite Lauren's unfriendly demeanor, Chanty steeled herself. "My prince, would you like some tea? Shall I fetch you some?" Lauren asked Vasper with a smile. "No. Thank you," Vasper replied, then walked away, unaware that Chanty stayed behind and turned to face Lauren. Chanty quickly spoke, urgency clear in her tone as she tried to catch Lauren before Vasper noticed. "Lauren, please, can you tell me how I can meet Jake? Somewhere outside the kingdom where we can meet? Please," Chanty pleaded, her voice hurried. Lauren hesitated, uncertain whether to answer Chanty's question, knowing that Jake wasn't allowed to enter the Sylvan Concord. She stared at Chanty, her expression frozen, unsure of what to do. Chanty, visibly nervous, waited, her anxiety growing as she glanced over her shoulder, and there he was. Vasper had returned. Panicking, Chanty hastily whispered to Lauren, "Let's meet later, outside my room, before dinner." Without waiting for a response, she left, brushing past Vasper and hurrying toward the vehicle waiting outside the dome. Vasper's serious gaze followed Chanty, his sharp eyes then locking on Lauren. He studied her face intently, his expression unreadable but undeniably stern, trying to gauge what had just been discussed. His presence made Lauren's heart race, her breath hitching as Vasper stepped closer to her. The weight of his aura was overwhelming, making her feel as though she might melt under his intense scrutiny. "Lauren," Vasper began in a low, commanding tone that demanded attention. "Listen carefully. This is very important. The seriousness in his voice and the piercing look in his eyes sent a wave of fear through Lauren, replacing the earlier fluttering in her chest. I do not want Jake to find out what happened here regarding Chanty. Any information reaching Jake, I will assume it came from you. Unless you plan to speak to your cousin directly, he continued, his voice firm and unyielding. Lauren felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed under his glare. They stood in silence for several tense moments, his words hanging heavily in the air. Nearby, other women watched them, smiling faintly, misinterpreting the interaction. Mustering her courage, Lauren finally spoke, though her lips trembled and her body quivered from the tension. But, my prince, Chanty is my cousin's wife. She has the right to know her husband's situation if she asks about him, she said, her voice shaky but steady enough to convey her point. Lauren, Vasper replied, his tone icy, before Jake, I was Chanty's boyfriend. Jake stole her from me. That's why I'm taking her back. His words struck Lauren like a thunderclap. Her eyes widened in shock as Vasper continued, their marriage means nothing, even in the outer world. Here in the Sylvan Concord, it can be annulled without question. Without waiting for a reply, Vasper turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Lauren standing there, stunned and motionless. The pain in her chest intensified. Hearing the truth directly from Vasper's lips crushed her. The earlier question from Chanty only deepened her turmoil, her thoughts spiraling into chaos. The weight of the tension pressed on her until she could no longer bear it. She walked to the washroom to rinse her body. Lauren stayed inside for a long time, unable to leave due to the emotions overwhelming her. She cried, pouring out the pain she felt for Vasper. In her heart, it felt like all her efforts within the Sylvan Concord to be close to Vasper Mondragon had been in vain. The weight of her heartbreak crushed her, leaving her feeling utterly broken. Even when she had stood bare before Vasper, he hadn't given her any attention. He hadn't even glanced at her body, not at her proud, shapely breasts or any part of her. His eyes hadn't lingered, not even for a second. The beauty of Chanty was simply different from Lauren's. Lauren's aura was fierce, commanding, and bold, while Chanty possessed an angelic face and a softer, more delicate charm. Though they both had perfect figures, Chanty's allure stood out more, effortlessly tempting Vasper Mondragon. This thought tormented Lauren as she soaked in the water, trying to reduce the swelling in her eyes from crying. Her tears mingled with the bathwater, a futile attempt to wash away the ache in her heart. Meanwhile, Chanty and Vasper sat silently in their vehicle, tension thick in the air. Vasper suspected Chanty's earlier conversation with Lauren involved Jake. Moments later, they arrived at their sanctuary. Vasper exited first, waiting for Chanty, his eyes searching hers as she avoided his gaze and walked straight to her room, carrying her clothes. Vasper followed her. Sensing his presence, Chanty turned sharply. Vasper, please don't come into my room, I need to change, she said firmly. Do you realize what will happen to Jake if he's caught in the Sylvan Concord? Vasper replied, his tone low and ominous. He'll be thrown into the dungeons, stripped of his power, and imprisoned in a place so harsh it's inescapable. That's why I won't let you make a move that would seal Jake's fate. Chanty froze, her eyes welling up with tears. She opened the massive door to her room, entered, and slammed it shut, locking it behind her. Vasper stood outside, resting his hand on the carved wood, bowing his head. Moments later, he summoned elven servants to fetch a key for Chanty's door. Meanwhile, Chanty lay in her bed, weeping uncontrollably. The weight of her longing for Jake pressed on her chest, so intense it felt like a year had passed since she last saw him. The fear planted by Vasper only deepened her distress, his threats haunting her thoughts. Suddenly, the device Mara had given her, resting on the bedside table, emitted a soft beep. Startled, Chanty raised her tear-streaked face from the bed, her expression filled with anxiety. She glanced toward the source of the sound, only to find Vasper standing beside her bed, holding the device. His presence was unsettling, and his penetrating gaze ignited a deeper anger in her, an anger already fueled by his earlier threats about what could happen to Jake if he ever dared to visit Sylvan Concord. With defiance burning in her eyes, Chanty snatched the device from Vasper's hand, her movements sharp and deliberate. The silence between them was abruptly broken by Mara's voice emanating from the device. Your Highness, in 10 minutes, the vehicle will arrive to take you for field training, Mara announced. Chanty, summoning all her strength to suppress the shakiness in her voice caused by her tears, responded, Yes, Mara, thank you. I'll be ready in 10 minutes. Thank you, Your Highness, Mara replied before the device went silent. Vasper remained motionless, his gaze fixed on Chanty. His face was an unreadable mix of pity and anguish as he observed her. He knew those tears were for Jake, and the realization pained him deeply. Determined to maintain her composure, Chanty climbed out of bed, deliberately ignoring Vasper's presence. Her jaw clenched, her face a mask of restrained fury. Without acknowledging him, she moved toward her closet, feeling his eyes following her every step. Inside the closet, she found uniforms labeled for training. They resembled military gear, their serious design a stark reminder of the intense regimen she was about to face. Unease coiled in her stomach as she wondered what the training would entail. After dressing, she styled her hair into a neat bun, smoothing down every strand with care. Standing before the mirror, she scrutinized her reflection. There was a fierceness in her gaze, yet an underlying vulnerability lingered, her delicate beauty enhanced by the outfit. Her eyes, red and swollen from crying, only seemed to amplify their captivating allure. Noticing the effects of the golden bath she had taken, Chanty observed how her skin appeared more radiant and firm. She ran her fingers over her arms, marveling at the golden glow that seemed to emanate from her complexion. The bath had indeed worked wonders, explaining why the process required full immersion for optimal effect. Emerging from the closet, Chanty was met with Vasper's unwavering gaze. His hands were in his pockets, but the admiration on his face was unmistakable. His eyes traveled from her bun down to her combat boots, lingering on her transformation. Chanty, however, refused to meet his gaze. She brushed past him, intent on leaving the room without giving him the satisfaction of her attention. As she stepped out, she heard his footsteps behind her, a silent shadow she couldn't shake. When they reached the vehicle waiting outside, Chanty quickly climbed in, eager to escape his proximity. Inside, she was startled to find the space already filled with women, all wearing similar training uniforms. Among them was Lauren, her stern expression directed squarely at Chanty. Chanty hesitated for a moment before sitting next to Lauren. "Hi," she greeted softly, but Lauren gave no response, her cold demeanor unyielding. Vasper entered the vehicle next, immediately drawing the attention of everyone present. The women's eyes trailed him as he moved, his lone male presence commanding the space. Chanty instinctively shrank behind Lauren, trying to hide from his gaze. Lauren, sensing her unease, glanced back at her, her lips twitching with amusement. But the joy Lauren felt at Vasper's presence was evident, a subtle glow lighting her face. His presence was a source of motivation for her to endure whatever hardships awaited them. When Vasper's gaze found Chanty, he moved closer, his eyes softening. Without a word, he reached for her hand, pulling her toward him. Chanty froze, too mortified to protest in front of the others. Silence filled the vehicle, broken only by the soft rustle of fabric as Vasper guided her to sit beside him. Lauren's expression darkened, jealousy flickering across her face as she watched the interaction. Chanty, meanwhile, avoided Vasper's gaze, her face flushed with embarrassment and unease. The vehicle's doors shut with a decisive click, and a shift in the air signaled their departure. Moments later, the doors reopened, revealing a dense jungle. Chanty's breath caught as she peered outside, fear knotting her stomach. "A jungle?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are we supposed to do here?" Vasper tightened his grip on her hand, his tone calm yet firm. "Listen carefully to the elves who will give you instructions. Just follow what they say, Chanty." His fingers pressed gently against hers, grounding her in the midst of her confusion and fear. Chanty's hand, cold with anxiety, remained in his grasp. Lauren, stepping out of the vehicle first, cast a sharp glare at their entwined hands, her jealousy clear. But before Chanty could react, Vasper leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her lips. The unexpected gesture stunned her into stillness. Overwhelmed by her fear and the sudden intimacy, Chanty could only gaze into Vasper's eyes, which held a rare tenderness. "You'll be fine," he murmured. "I love you. I'll wait for you at the facility." Chanty didn't respond, her emotions swirling too chaotically for words. As the staff overseeing the training approached, they addressed Vasper. "Your Highness, you cannot accompany her further. Only participants are allowed in the jungle." Reluctantly, Vasper released Chanty's hand. His expression was a mixture of worry and resolve as he nodded. "Go," he urged softly, his voice steady despite the ache in his eyes. Chanty hesitated but eventually joined the line of participants. The vehicle doors closed behind her, disappearing in an instant. The oppressive heat of the jungle and the haunting cries of distant animals enveloped her, amplifying her unease. Lauren's mocking voice broke through the silence. "In the outer world, weren't your guardians supposed to train you? Isn't that their job, to protect and prepare you? From the looks of it, you've had no experience at all." Humiliated, Chanty lowered her gaze, unable to muster a retort. An elf began handing out compasses, explaining their task. "This compass points to the facility where we'll be waiting for you. Your goal is to find the flower of passion, this." He held up a radiant bloom with petals in every color of the rainbow. "You'll find them scattered throughout this part of the jungle. Be warned, the flowers do not want to be picked. Their songs and music will lure you into sleep, but you must resist." The group listened in tense silence, the weight of the challenge sinking in as they each received a compass. Chanty's hands trembled as she accepted the compass, its needle pointing resolutely toward the facility they needed to find. The elf leader's warning rang sharply in her ears: "If you return to the facility without the flower, the punishment is to bathe in a lake full of leeches." "Understood?" Chanty's fear deepened, and her chest tightened as she nodded in acknowledgement. Lauren's piercing gaze fell on Chanty, her lips curling into a mocking smile. "Are you okay?" Lauren's tone dripped with ridicule. "Do your best to make it back to the facility. If you succeed, I might teach you how to find Jake." Chanty froze, Lauren's words igniting a faint, desperate hope within her. "Mark your words, Lauren." "I'm trusting you," Chanty replied with determination. "Yes, Chanty. But there will be conditions," Lauren said slyly, her laughter filled with condescension as she turned away. Moments later, the elf leader signaled for the group to disperse. One by one, they sprinted into the jungle, their mission clear: to find the elusive flower of passion. Chanty hesitated, standing frozen as her thoughts spiraled. Around her, the jungle pulsed with life, the calls of unseen creatures echoed through the dense greenery. Her fingers fumbled as she zipped the compass securely into her pocket. She pushed forward, parting massive leaves that loomed over her like green shields, their size making her feel small, insignificant. The enormity of the trees dwarfed her existence, their canopies so high they seemed to scrape the heavens. Beneath them, giant mushrooms dotted the jungle floor, bizarre and otherworldly. A faint sound of rushing water reached her ears, guiding her steps toward a small stream. The stream led her to a grand waterfall, its sheer magnificence stopping her in her tracks. From her vantage point atop the falls, Chanty gazed down, her breath catching. The waterfall thundered as it plunged into a misty abyss so deep she couldn't see where the water landed. Around her, the foliage was lush, towering, and endless. How would she ever find the flower? Panic threatened to overwhelm her as tears streamed down her cheeks. She thought of the dire situation, her fears, and, most of all, Jake. "Why," she whispered bitterly, tears falling freely. "Why do I have to go through this? What is all this for? To defeat Alexander Mondragon? Why was I born as Don Lorenzo, bearer of the Sword of Destiny? Why can't I just live a normal life?" Her heart constricted at the thought of the legendary weapon. Almost instinctively, she imagined the sword materializing in her hand. A surge of crimson energy pulsed from its blade, coursing down its length with raw power. Without hesitation, she swung the sword at the dense undergrowth before her. The strike, imbued with an unseen force, cleared a wide path. A laugh escaped her lips, an unexpected burst of relief. "Thank you," she exclaimed, planting a kiss on the hilt of the sword. Yet, as she stood there, a vision flashed in her mind, a vision she did not want to acknowledge. It filled her with dread, and she quickly shook her head to dismiss it. Her grip on the sword tightened, its energy comforting yet foreboding. Was that a prophecy? She muttered, her chest heavy with fear. Resolving to focus, she pressed forward, clearing her path with each powerful swing of the blade. The dense vegetation fell away like paper under its might. But the vision haunted her. No matter how much she tried to push it away, the memory clung to her. It wasn't just a vision, it was a cruel revelation. Her tears returned, unbidden and unstoppable. "Jake! I want you, I need you now," she cried into the solitude, her voice raw and desperate. She dropped to her knees amidst the wild undergrowth, her sobs echoing. "Jake," she screamed, her voice cracking. "I miss you, my love." For a moment, she allowed herself to weep unabashedly. When she finally calmed, she wiped her eyes with the back of her trembling hand and looked at the sword again. Curiosity tugged at her, though dread still lingered. Slowly, she brought the sword closer to her lips. Another flash overwhelmed her senses. This time, it was vivid, unmistakable. She saw herself entwined with Vasper, their bodies bare as they shared an intimate moment on a bed. Their moans and gasps echoed in her mind, their passion undeniable. Her eyes widened in horror, rage burning through her veins. "No," she screamed, her hands shaking. With all her might, she hurled the sword into the distance, only to watch it disappear into thin air. But the sword reappeared in her hand as if bound to her soul. "I hate you," she spat at the weapon, tears streaming down her face. "One day, I'll rid myself of you. I promise." She continued walking, cutting through the jungle as her emotions surged uncontrollably. "I hate you, Vasper," she screamed. "I hate you." Her thoughts flickered to the kiss they had shared before she left the vehicle, the way his touch lingered on her hand, the way he had held her. Shame burned in her chest. "You're so stupid, Chanty." So stupid, she berated herself. Suddenly, a large shadow fell before her. From a towering tree, a massive black snake descended, its head shaped like a heart and its body thick and menacing. Chanty froze, her feet rooted to the ground as the snake rose, its head lifting higher and higher until it loomed over her, tongue flicking ominously. The snake's sheer size dwarfed her, and its cold, calculating gaze sent a shiver down her spine. "This is where I die," she thought, unable to move. Her heartbeat thundered in her chest as she instinctively glanced at the sword in her hand. The crimson energy flared, illuminating the space around her. The snake slithered closer to Chanty, its massive body undulating with terrifying precision. Chanty's entire body trembled uncontrollably, consumed by fear. "Help!" she screamed in her mind, though no sound escaped her lips. Her vision darkened, and her breaths came shallow and quick, failing to fill her lungs. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into the undergrowth, unconscious. Cold water splashing on her face startled Chanty awake. She gasped and scrambled upright, her heart pounding as the memory of the snake flooded her mind. Her wide, panicked eyes darted around, only to find herself at the edge of a stream. Beside her stood Lauren, her expression sharp and unyielding. "Lauren?" Chanty whispered, her voice quivering. "Thank you, but the snake? Where is it? That huge snake?" Her words were frantic, her tone laced with terror. "Shut up, Chanty," Lauren snapped, her voice cold and biting. "Something as simple as a snake, weren't you taught by the guardians what to do in such situations? Or did you waste your time in the outer world, fooling around? Is that why you got married so early?" Chanty froze, stunned by Lauren's unfiltered words. "You act like some kind of princess. And you? You're supposed to face Alexander? Challenge him? You fainted over a simple snake." Lauren threw her head back and laughed harshly. "The guardians truly failed you," she added with a sneer. Chanty's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "Watch your mouth, Lauren. You can insult me, but don't you dare speak ill of the guardians. They've done everything to protect me. David and the others, they're like family to me." Lauren smirked, her gaze unwavering. "Fine. Not failures, just irresponsible. Look at what they've done to you. They've made you weak, scared, and useless. Sure, you're beautiful, but you're also cowardly and helpless. Chanty's jaw dropped. It was the first time someone had spoken to her with such brutal honesty. Lauren's words cut deep, each one a dagger to her pride. Lauren's piercing gaze bore into her. I can't believe someone as foolish as you caught Vasper's attention. Do you even know how many years I trained in Sylvan Concord? All for him. I waited for the day he'd choose a wife, hoping it'd be me. But now? This is what I get. I've been replaced by someone so pathetic. Chanty couldn't hold back any longer. Lauren, she shouted, her voice firm and defiant. If I'm a fool, then you're delusional. Take Vasper. I don't care about him, he's yours. The only one I care about is Jake. She rose to her feet, her eyes blazing with newfound determination as she faced Lauren head-on. Lauren stared at her, momentarily stunned by Chanty's outburst. Chanty continued, her voice steady. Unlike you, I've never forced myself on anyone. Take your obsession with Vasper and keep it to yourself. With that, Chanty turned on her heel and stormed away, her anger fueling each step. Lauren stood there, grinding her teeth in frustration as she watched Chanty disappear into the jungle. Chanty's words echoed in her mind, stinging her pride. Chanty pushed deeper into the jungle, her focus shifting back to her task, finding the flower of passion. Lauren's harsh words lingered in her thoughts, but instead of fear, she felt a simmering anger. Coward? Useless? Chanty's grip tightened around her sword. She swung it fiercely, cutting through the dense vegetation with ease. Where is that stupid flower? She muttered under her breath. The memory of the massive snake haunted her. Simple, huh? How did Lauren even deal with it? That thing was huge. She scowled, her frustration bubbling up as she trudged forward. Her steps faltered when her gaze landed on something breathtaking, a single flower glowing with rainbow hues. It stood alone, ethereal and mesmerizing. Chanty's jaw dropped as she took in its beauty. Slowly, she approached it, awestruck. You're so beautiful, she murmured, her voice filled with wonder. Can I plant you in the garden Jake and I share? Her thoughts drifted to a vision of the flower adorning their home, blooming near the swimming pool. She bent closer, inhaling its fresh scent, and marveled at the mist clinging to its delicate petals. Looking around, she searched for any stray seeds or stems she could take with her, but there were none. Suddenly, a melody filled the air, a lullaby so hauntingly sweet it made her pause. The sound seemed to cradle her, lulling her into a peaceful daze. Chanty snapped to attention, remembering the warning, not to succumb to the flower's temptations. Was this what the elven meant? The melody grew stronger, pulling at her consciousness. She felt her eyelids grow heavy. No, she thought, shaking her head as she reached out to pluck the flower. As her fingers wrapped around the stem, another hand shot forward, yanking the flower away. Everything happened in a blur, and Chanty blinked in shock as Lauren stood before her, the flower in her grasp. Lauren's lips curled into a smug grin. You're not the only one who knows how to take what they want, she said mockingly before turning and dashing away. Chanty stood frozen, her mouth agape in disbelief. The lullaby faded, leaving only silence and the crushing realization that the flower was gone. Lauren had stolen it. Chanty's fists clenched, but she knew she had no choice. She had to start her search anew. Failure meant being thrown into the leech-filled lake, and she wouldn't let that happen. With a heavy heart, Chanty resumed her search. Hunger gnawed at her, exhaustion weighing her down. Her clothes were soaked from the jungle's mist, and the terrain seemed endless. Yet she pressed on, her determination unwavering. She ignored the captivating sights around her, from the vibrant birds with their dazzling colors to the rare, exotic plants that dotted the jungle. There was no time for distractions. Her goal was clear: find another flower, no matter what. Chanty found herself in another world, one entirely unfamiliar to her. The creatures around her were strange, save for the ever-dreaded snake. As she ventured deeper, she came upon enormous rock formations that towered over her. Pressing onward, she saw one of her companions clutching a flower, grinning triumphantly. "Chanty," the companion called out, holding the flower up as if to flaunt it. "I'm ahead of you. See you back there." With that, they turned and dashed toward the facility, leaving Chanty to sigh heavily, her shoulders weighed down by exhaustion. Chanty glanced at her sword and murmured, "Can you help me?" To her surprise, the sword of destiny glowed faintly, projecting a vision of the path she needed to take. Her eyes lit up as she saw the flower in the sword's revelation. "Really? Where do I go?" she whispered eagerly. Without wasting a moment, she followed the guidance shown by the sword. Eventually, she reached the spot where the flower bloomed. Wasting no time, she plucked it swiftly, ensuring she wouldn't succumb to its lullaby. She laughed with relief, clutching the flower tightly. Taking out her compass, she let it guide her back toward the facility. Running as fast as her legs could carry her, she kept her eyes glued to the compass while gripping the flower protectively. The path began to change as she moved forward. The dense vegetation gave way to a sparse, almost barren landscape filled with withered plants and dead shrubs. The contrast puzzled her. She checked the compass again, it still pointed her forward. Chanty pressed on, though unease crept into her thoughts. Without warning, she collided with an invisible wall. Stumbling through it, she found herself in a completely different setting. In front of her loomed a massive cube-shaped facility, its surface gleaming. Surrounding the structure were circular vehicles bearing the logo of Sylvan Concord. Relief flooded Chanty, she had made it. Walking toward the facility, she noticed her companions arriving one by one, each holding their own flower. The entrance was peculiar, resembling a window of water. As they stepped through, their bodies seemed to merge with the liquid barrier. When it was Chanty's turn, she hesitated briefly before stepping inside. The interior was a pristine white hallway, long and gleaming. As she walked forward, jets of water suddenly poured from the ceiling. Chanty gasped as the water, frothy with bubbles, cascaded over her. She quickly undid her bun and scrubbed her hair, letting the cleansing stream wash over her. Her companions moved through the shower casually. Some were completely naked, unbothered by the exposure. Chanty blushed, trying not to stare, but she couldn't help feeling self-conscious. Unlike them, she kept her clothes on while bathing. It was clear this lack of modesty was normal for them, but Chanty was not accustomed to it. Moving onward, Chanty came to another chamber, a pool filled with what appeared to be liquid gold. Her companions had already discarded their clothes and waded into the shimmering substance, their flowers tucked behind their ears. Chanty hesitated. Did she really have to undress? She glanced around nervously and noticed Lauren's head poking out of the golden pool, her sharp gaze fixed on Chanty. Reluctantly, Chanty removed her clothes, reasoning that they were all women here. She placed her garments in the small baskets provided along the hallway. As she stepped into the pool, she felt the liquid gold cling to her skin. Her companion smiled at her with subtle admiration, though Lauren's expression remained as cold and piercing as ever. The warmth of the golden bath was unlike anything Chanty had experienced. It was soothing yet invigorating, as if the liquid seeped into her very core, washing away her exhaustion and pain. Her skin tingled pleasantly, and every ache from her journey vanished. Closing her eyes, she let the sensation envelop her. When she opened her eyes, her gaze locked with Lauren's. Neither of them spoke, the tension between them palpable. Then, without a word, Lauren stood and strode toward the hallway, her golden form glistening. The others followed her, leaving Chanty with only a few remaining companions. Chanty reluctantly stood, her body reluctant to leave the comforting warmth of the pool. She followed the others, their golden-coated bodies gleaming as they walked down the hall. Another shower awaited them, this one gentler. The soft water rinsed away the liquid gold, leaving behind skin that felt fresh and fragrant. Chanty marveled at the pleasant scent, it was like a mix of vanilla and roses. As she continued, a warm breeze enveloped her. She passed through a large dryer that left her completely dry, her hair soft and shiny. The flower she carried remained vibrant and unscathed, as if untouched by the elements. Chanty soon entered a mirrored closet room. She opened the shimmering doors to find an array of dresses, elegant and diverse, each one seemingly made for royalty. Her jaw dropped at the sight. Her companions were already selecting dresses, their beauty enhanced by the garments they wore. Chanty opened more closets but found no pants, shirts, or even joggers. She searched for underwear but found none. Confused, she asked one of her companions, but they simply shook their head. There were no undergarments here. She laughed bitterly. Abundant in gold but no underwear? They can't afford underwear? Ridiculous, she said angrily. All the dresses were of different styles, none of them included pants, and especially no underwear. She just chose one dress she felt comfortable with. She changed into it, a dress above the knee in length, long-sleeved but made of thin fabric, with a slight cleavage and in a skin tone color. But why was there no underwear? She looked at herself in the mirror. Even she admired her reflection. She had no choice but to walk, even without wearing any underwear. Did that mean everyone here wasn't wearing underwear? Feeling awkward, she walked with an uneasy expression, glancing at her companions. None of them seemed to be wearing underwear either. When they reached a spacious room surrounded by individual chairs along the walls, they each took a seat. She wondered what they were waiting for in the room. She looked around for a door. Then men entered, some of them elves, and others like her, human-like but with elven ears. They had different faces, but Vasper Mondragon entered directly to her spot, his expression stern. "Let's go," said Vasper. Chanty looked around, confused, seeing the others being taken one by the men who had entered. Reluctantly, she followed Vasper, who tried to hold her hand, but she didn't let him. Chanty looked for Lauren and saw her with a handsome prince, evident by his crown. But when their eyes met, Lauren gave Chanty a sharp look. Vasper walked straight, and their companions entered what appeared to be rooms. Chanty was puzzled. "Vasper, where are they going?" she asked, but Vasper didn't answer. He just kept walking down the hallway. Eventually, it was just the two of them left. When they reached a door, Vasper tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. "Fuck!" Vasper yelled, frustrated, gripping the doorknob shaped like a dragon's head. The door looked like the wing of a giant bird. "We can't get out," Vasper said. "What? Why not?" Chanty asked. "Until you eat the flower, the door won't open," Vasper replied. Chanty was shocked, staring at the flower in her hand. "This can be eaten?" Vasper nodded. "The door detects if you've eaten the flower or not. It will open once the flower is in your system." Chanty was confused. "Vasper, I don't understand. What is this flower for? Why do I need to eat it?" she asked. "Eat the flower in one of the rooms," Vasper said hesitantly. "What? No. I'm not going into that room with you. Are you out of your mind?" Chanty exclaimed, her eyes wide. Frustrated, Vasper turned to her. "Let's just wait for someone to come out of a room. Maybe we can leave with them," he said. They glared at each other, and Vasper looked at her from head to toe. Chanty's face flushed from his gaze. "You look so beautiful," Vasper said in a sultry voice. Chanty didn't respond, glaring sharply at him. "I can't get enough of looking at you, Chanty," Vasper continued. His eyes on her seemed like he wanted to devour her whole. "Shut up, Vasper. I don't want to hear any more from you." "I want to go home," Chanty said, moving closer to the door to try and open it herself. But the door wouldn't budge. "What will happen if I eat this flower?" Chanty asked. "I'm not sure," Vasper lied. "This isn't poison, right?" "No," Vasper replied, looking at her seriously. "Then why didn't anyone tell us I needed to eat this when we arrived?" Chanty asked. Vasper kept silent, just staring at her with a knowing look. Minutes passed, and someone emerged from one of the rooms. It was Lauren and the prince. The prince had his arm around Lauren's waist as they walked toward Vasper and Chanty by the door. But Lauren's gaze was on Vasper, sharp and intense, while Vasper only glanced at her once before diverting his gaze back to Chanty. The prince glanced at Chanty and smiled graciously, and Chanty returned the smile. But Vasper glared at the prince. Chanty noticed and stared Vasper in disbelief. "He looks like a jealous boyfriend." Chanty wondered why Lauren was suddenly so sweet with the prince. Did she have a boyfriend? The prince? Chanty questioned herself. When Lauren reached Chanty, she glanced at the flower in Chanty's hand and laughed. "Aren't you planning to go home? Are you staying here?" Lauren asked, staring at the flower. "Go ahead, eat it, Chanty. Let's see how far you can go," Lauren said, as she and the prince exited through the now open door. Vasper quickly tried to follow, but he couldn't get through as if an invisible wall blocked him. Lauren turned to look at Vasper, smiling before shutting the door again. Chanty gaped at Vasper in disbelief as they stared at each other. Chanty looked at the flower in her hand. She smelled it. What could it taste like? She nibbled on it, tasting a small piece. Vasper's curious gaze was fixed on her. "Eat it inside the room," Vasper said. "I'll just eat it here," Chanty replied. She wondered why everyone else went into the rooms. Maybe she should eat it there too. Chanty entered one of the rooms and locked the door. It was a small room but cool, as though there was air conditioning, though none was visible. She double-locked the door to keep Vasper from entering. She sat on the bed and quickly devoured the flower. It tasted sweet, like honey. "This actually tastes good," she thought, smiling as she continued eating it. She couldn't believe it was edible and this sweet. It was incredibly delicious and fragrant. After swallowing the flower, she assumed they could now leave. She stood and opened the door, but suddenly felt something strange. She stepped out of the room and saw Vasper, who seemed to understand. He rushed over to her and ushered her back inside. "Don't come out just yet," Vasper said. Meanwhile, Chanty felt her body stiffen as she sat back down on the bed. Vasper waited outside the door while the others began emerging from their rooms. The rooms were soundproof, so no noise could be heard from inside. Inside, Chanty rolled on the bed, moaning, feeling her body heat up. She lay face down on the bed, calling out, "Jake. I need my husband." She repeatedly said his name amidst her moans. Her body felt like it was on fire, and she was craving something. She breathed heavily, her body burning hot. "I hate that flower. I hate this place," Chanty screamed. She removed her dress, now completely naked, writhing on the bed. "My body." She moved like a worm, biting into the pillow. "Oh!" Chanty screamed. No matter what she did, her body kept craving. Suddenly, the door opened and Vasper entered. He stood there, looking at her on the bed. "Vasper! Get out! I don't need you here, I need my husband. I need Jake!" Chanty cried in the middle of her moans. "I hate that flower," Chanty added, but Vasper continued staring at her as if intoxicated. Hurriedly, Vasper removed his shirt and pants. Chanty panicked. "No. Not you!" Chanty exclaimed, but it was too late. Vasper approached her, climbed on top of her, and they began kissing fervently. Vasper's hand found its way to Chanty's sensitive flesh, already wet to the touch. Overwhelmed by the heat in her body, Chanty responded to Vasper's kisses. Their moans and groans filled the room, blending together. "I miss you so much," Vasper murmured repeatedly, his voice laden with emotion. "I love you so much, Chanty. I love you," he said as though reciting a prayer. Chanty, lost in the fire coursing through her body, could no longer resist the sensations. Vasper's touches ignited something primal within her. Vasper's lips trailed down between Chanty's thighs, and she cried out his name, overwhelmed by the pleasure her body sought. Chanty's body moved aggressively in response to Vasper's mouth and tongue playing with her sensitive flesh. Her hands gripped Vasper's hair tightly, pressing him closer. Vasper's hands cradled Chanty's breasts gently, his movements reverent. As Chanty climbed toward the peak of her pleasure, her breathing quickened, matching the rhythm of Vasper's tongue. He eagerly savored every reaction she gave. When Chanty finally reached her climax, she moaned Vasper's name, her voice like music to his ears. For Vasper, her cries of pleasure brought him joy beyond measure, lifting his spirit to the heavens. Chanty collapsed like a fallen leaf, her strength completely spent. Her arms and hands, which had been gripping Vasper's hair, now lay limp at her sides. But Vasper wasn't finished. He continued to taste her sensitive flesh, insatiable, while Chanty's body began to respond again. Vasper! Chanty moaned once more, as the feelings surged back within her. Vasper remained steadfast, giving her everything she needed. After a few more minutes, Chanty reached her second climax, her body completely drained of energy. She lay still, surrendering to whatever Vasper was doing to her body. Vasper still hadn't finished. He trailed kisses up her stomach to her breasts, worshipping each one with his lips. He kissed her neck, then her lips. "I love you so much," Vasper whispered as Chanty stared blankly at the ceiling, lost in her thoughts. She felt like she was dreaming. Was this what she saw in the memory shown to her by the Sword of Destiny? Had it already happened? Vasper continued to kiss her, showering her face with kisses, moving back to her neck and down to her breasts. Over and over, he kissed her, his devotion evident. Vasper's head descended again between Chanty's thighs, devouring her once more. He looked starved as he played with Chanty's sensitive flesh, worshipping it with his hands and lips. "I missed this so much," he murmured while continuing to kiss and caress her. His tongue teased her again, and Chanty's body responded instinctively. For the third time, the sensations began to build inside her. Heat coursed through her body, her breathing grew heavier, and the pleasure Vasper was giving her overwhelmed her senses. She felt as if she were in heaven, unable to escape the feelings consuming her. Her mind tried to resist, but her body succumbed to its desires. Vasper felt Chanty's body responding once again to his touch, fueling his passion further. He pressed his hardened length against Chanty's sensitive flesh, teasing her at the entrance and along the center. Chanty's hips bucked in response to his movements, her deep moans filling the room. Vasper quickened his teasing, drawing out every ounce of her desire. Chanty's hands searched for something to hold on to, feeling as if she might lose her mind from the overwhelming pleasure. She wanted him inside her, but it wasn't possible. Her frustration grew, making her movements even more aggressive. Her body writhed wildly, and Vasper couldn't help but watch her with fascination, his own desire intensifying. The room became hotter as their passion consumed them. Vasper climbed back over Chanty but continued his rhythmic teasing, rubbing himself against her sensitive flesh without entering. His mouth alternated between her breasts, sucking fervently while Chanty's hands clutched at his hair. Their movements grew faster, both of them nearing their peak. Chanty wrapped her legs tightly around Vasper's hips. Vasper groaned deeply, his sounds mixing with Chanty's moans. He captured her lips in a searing kiss, as if drawing the very breath from her lungs. Their tongues and lips danced feverishly, his intensity making it seem like he wanted to devour her completely. As they reached the height of their passion, Chanty's aggressive movements synced perfectly with Vasper's quickened pace. Their motions shook the bed, the creaking noise blending with their moans and groans. Chanty's muffled moans were caught in Vasper's mouth, as he refused to release her lips. Both their bodies tensed, and the room echoed with the sounds of their shared ecstasy. Chanty's arms locked tightly around Vasper's body. With one final, deliberate thrust, Vasper brought them both to climax. They groaned in unison, their bodies trembling as they were overtaken by pleasure. Vasper spilled himself onto Chanty's sensitive flesh, warm and thick. The room fell silent except for their heavy breathing. Their bodies remained entwined, holding each other so closely that not even air could pass between them. Minutes passed before Vasper finally released Chanty's lips. She gasped for air as her arms fell limp at her sides. She was utterly drained, her strength gone, her body spent. Both of them were soaked in sweat. Vasper reached for his shirt hanging on the headboard and used it to gently wipe the sweat from Chanty's face, neck, and chest. He then wiped his own face. He gazed at Chanty's face, his heart brimming with happiness. Staring at the woman he had longed to be with again filled him with immeasurable joy. He felt his love for her deepen. "I love you so much. Thank you for this moment. I'm so happy. I've been longing for this to happen again," Vasper said in a low, raspy voice. "You're mine, Chanty. You're always mine," he whispered as he kissed her cheek, neck, and lips. Chanty only stared into Vasper's eyes, unable to speak. She was in a daze, her body utterly exhausted, her strength depleted. Meanwhile, Vasper continued showering her with kisses. Chanty tried to feel if the effect of the flower had worn off. All she felt was exhaustion. Vasper stood up but remained kneeling between Chanty's thighs. He smiled at the sight of her sensitive flesh, glistening with his essence. He grabbed a blanket to clean up the mess he had left. His hand caressed Chanty's sensitive flesh as he softly said, "You're so beautiful, it's so beautiful." Chanty tried to close her thighs, but Vasper stopped her. "Not yet. I'm not done looking," he said with a smile. Chanty, too tired to resist, let him do as he pleased. "Vasper, I need to go home," Chanty said. Vasper's head lowered, and he kissed Chanty's sensitive flesh again, adding a gentle bite. Even though it was light, it still tickled her, making her gasp softly. Chanty grabbed her dress, intending to put it back on. At that moment, she felt weightless, as if her spirit was floating in the air. She couldn't understand what she was feeling. She wished it was all just a dream. She wished none of it had actually happened. Vasper pulled her into a tight embrace before she could even get dressed. "I love you so much, Chanty. I'm so happy right now." "Thank you," Vasper said earnestly. "From now on, I won't let you go back to Jake." Chanty froze, feeling as if she'd been doused with cold water. Vasper leaned in to kiss her again, but this time Chanty pushed him away. They stared at each other for a moment, Vasper's expression one of shock and disbelief. Chanty started to cry, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Isn't all of this just because of the flower I ate?" Chanty said softly, her voice trembling. "This isn't real." As she put her dress back on, Vasper simply stared at her, frozen in place. Chanty grabbed Vasper's shirt and threw it at him. He caught it but still didn't move. "Get dressed, Vasper," Chanty said coldly. "And just think of everything that happened as a dream. It's only because of the flower I ate." Her voice turned colder as she added, "Nothing changes between us. Our situation, our reality, it stays the same. My decisions stay the same." Vasper felt a sharp pain in his chest. The joy he'd just experienced was suddenly replaced by an aching sadness that he couldn't describe. Chanty walked out of the room, leaving Vasper standing there in shock. She made her way to the door, tears streaming down her face. She reached for the doorknob, turned it, and stepped out. She didn't wait for Vasper. Outside, a circular vehicle awaited her, its door already open, the inside brightly lit. Chanty entered the vehicle and sat down. The moment she sat, Vasper arrived, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. Chanty quickly looked away, avoiding his gaze. Vasper took a seat, but he stayed far away from her. Chanty's heart felt strange as she thought about what Vasper had done, but she refused to turn and look at him. She could feel Vasper's gaze on her, but she remained still, like a statue, as tears continued to flow from her eyes. Turning away from him, she tried to block out his presence. The vehicle door closed, and the energy around them shifted. Chanty felt the change. Suddenly, the vehicle door opened again, and she realized they had returned to her sanctuary. Without looking back, Chanty hurried out of the vehicle and headed straight to her room. Once she reached her door, she opened it, stepped inside. She looked back to see if Vasper had followed her, but he wasn't there. Relieved, she locked the door behind her. Chanty went to her bed, pulled the covers over herself, and broke down in tears. "I'm so sorry, Jake. I've sinned against you, please forgive me. I can't even face you now, Jake. How can I look you in the eyes?" Chanty's cries echoed through her room. "I've wronged you, Jake. Please forgive me. Forgive me, she sobbed, her voice breaking as she clutched her chest. Her crying grew louder, the pain in her heart unbearable and her guilt weighing heavily on her. All she could think about was Jake, her husband. She felt disgusted with herself, wishing she had never gone to the Sylvan Concord. Her cries for forgiveness continued to resonate throughout the room as she begged Jake for mercy, her heart filled with sorrow and regret.